Chapter 657. The High Priestess of the Mermaid Tribe could indeed split the tail of the Sharkmen into 2 legs and turn the Sharkmen into a human. However, the consequence of this was that once the leg-splitting technique was done, she would become a real human. Although she could walk freely on land, she would forever lose the qualification to be a Sharkman. Not only would she lose the lifespan of a Sharkman, but she would also not be able to enter the land of the Sharkmen. Yi Feng did not expect Yi Yu to be so resolute and so infatuated with that human. He was so angry at that time. After a long pause, he asked her coldly if she had really thought it through because the leg-splitting technique was also very painful. She would have to endure the pain for 2 days. He listed all the pros and cons of this spell to her, hoping that she would say that she regretted it. However, Yi Yu was determined and said that she had thought it through and would not regret it. The High Priestess of the Mermaid Tribe saw that Yi Feng was not happy and did not want to agree. In the end, Yi Yu knelt in front of Yi Feng and kept kowtowing, begging him to help her. She kowtowed until her forehead was full of blood. She said that she would not get up if he did not agree. She said that she was sorry for stabbing him that day and that she had received the punishment she deserved. She begged him to help her this time because they were siblings. She said that she would never bother him again. Yi Feng was angry and desperate. In the end, he finally agreed to her request. The pain of leg splitting was bone-piercing. Even the strong Sharkmen did not dare to try it. For thousands of years, there were very few Sharkmen who dared to split their legs. However, Yi Yu, who had always been afraid of pain and needed people to comfort her for a long time, did it without hesitation. When she walked into the High Priestess room to do the surgery, Yi Feng did not send her off because he was angry. However, he secretly sent a capable subordinate to check the settings in the High Priestess room. He hoped that the leg-splitting technique would be foolproof. Although he hated Yi Yu, he could not accept that she had any accidents during the process. During those 2 days, she underwent the surgery indoors while he lingered outside, never taking a single step out of the room. Even a grown man wouldn't be able to withstand that kind of pain, let alone the delicate Yi Yu. She couldn't help but scream out loud. Each of her screams was like a knife, cutting into Yi Feng's heart inch by inch. He was restless outside, and there were several times when he wanted to rush in without a care. However, he also knew that once this kind of surgery started, there was no room for regret. He had to finish it. For Yi Yu, every minute and second of those 2 days was torture. How could it not be the same for Yi Feng? In the end, he couldn't stand the heart-wrenching feeling anymore. He couldn't bear to listen to her blood-curdling screams and finally left. Yi Feng thought that he would feel better as long as he didn't hear anything. As long as he didn't hear anything, his heart wouldn't hurt so much. However, he did not expect that after leaving, he would feel even more flustered and confused. No matter what he did, he could not continue to do it. He could only drink until he was drunk again. He told himself that as long as he was drunk and woke up, everything would be over. He was indeed drunk and slept. He even had a nightmare. In his dream, Yi Yu was looking at him blankly with blood all over her body. He was scared awake by the nightmare. When he was about to get up, he received bad news. Yi Yu didn't make it. She couldn't make it. Yi Feng felt as if he was struck by lightning. He stumbled to the High Priestess room and saw Yi Yu, who was covered in blood and barely breathing. Chapter 658. Yi Yu had already lost her consciousness. Yi Feng held her in his arms and tried his best to transfer his psychokinesis into her body. He wanted to save her life, but no matter what he did, it was to no avail. This surgery was meant to be a success or death. In the end, Yi Yu died in his arms. When she was half unconscious, she kept repeating the same sentence. She said that she did not want to see this result. She wanted to become a human. She did not want to be Sharkmen anymore. She did not want to return to the mermaid tribe anymore. At the moment of death, Yi Yu had a momentary flash of consciousness. Her mind was clear for a few seconds. Her lifeless eyes looked at Yi Feng, who was holding her. The last sentence she left him was, "Yi Feng, I hate you. I do not want to be your sister anymore." When he said this, Yi Feng's voice trembled again. The bonfire next to them crackled. What happened after that? This was a tragic story. Ning Xuemore felt sad when she heard it. Although sharkmen have a long life, once they die, they will truly die. They will not be reincarnated. I knew that Yi Yu's only wish before she died was to be a human, so I used a forbidden technique to keep her soul. I sent her into reincarnation so that she could truly be a human. Yi Feng's voice finally calmed down. Ning Xuemore looked at him. What price did you pay for using the forbidden technique? She believed that Yi Feng must have paid a heavy price. Yi Feng's voice was calm. He did not want to talk about this. No matter the price, it is not as important as her final wish. Yi Yu reincarnated into Yang Ziyuan. Then, did the person she originally liked reincarnate into Jiyu Xian? Ning Xuemore asked the key question. It's him. Yi Feng's voice was bitter. Whether it was in the previous life or this life, she was obsessed with him. Ning Xuemore suddenly realized something was wrong. That's not right. If Jiyu Xian is the reincarnation of that man, then he should be younger than Yang Ziyuan, right? But as far as I know, Jiyu Xian is 8 years older than her. Could it be that Jiyu Xian died before Yi Yu in his previous life? Yi Feng shook his head slightly. Miss Ning, you may not know this, but Yi Yu was forced to reincarnate by me using a forbidden technique. Her soul was incomplete after she died, and by the time I finished her soul and sent her to reincarnate, it was already 100 years after that incident. Jiyu Xian's previous life was a natural death. He only passed away 90 years after Yi Yu's death, and he was 110 years old when he died. Ning Xuemore glanced at him. You seem to know a lot about him. Yi Feng did not hide anything. I found out about this later. After Yi Yu's death, I was unwilling to accept it. After being dispirited for a while, I also went ashore and tried to find that man. I thought that since Yi Yu was in love with him and died for him, I should at least tell him. Even if he cried for Yi Yu, it would be considered as getting some justice for Yi Yu. After meeting that man, I found out a little about Yi Yu after she went ashore. Yi Feng's voice was a little bitter. That man was sincere to her, but she was after all a sharkmen. That man's family was so big that they even chose a fiancé for him. After he brought Yi Yu back to the family, their marriage was opposed by the whole family. They said that she could only be a concubine and could not be the main wife. This is probably the main reason why Yi Yu came back and risked her life to be the second wife, right? She desperately wanted to be a human. Chapter 659. Yi Feng's voice dimmed. However, Ning Xuemore kept feeling that something was not quite right. But she could not put her finger on it. She paused and asked, "What did that man say when you found him?" Yi Feng's voice sounded distant. He was very sad when he heard about Yi Yu's death, but he refused to admit that Yi Yu died for him. He talked nonsense, saying that Yi Yu had someone else in her heart. I hated him for not daring to admit what he did. He made Yi Yu suffer, so I beat him up. That bastard did not fight back at that time. The more I beat him, the more he laughed. In the end, he said that the person in Yi Yu's heart was actually me. He also said that she wanted to go back to the sea to find me, not to become a human. Ning Xuemore, she pondered for a moment. Have you considered that what that man said might be true? Yi Yu actually liked you? But she did not see her own heart clearly at that time. Yi Feng was stunned and shook his head firmly. Impossible. If she loved me, why would she hurt me and leave with that man? Why would she risk her life to become a human? Why would she fall in love with that man in this life? Ning Xuemore sighed. Haven't you heard that a woman's heart is like a needle at the bottom of the sea? A woman's heart is the most difficult to guess. She thought for a moment and suddenly said, "Did Yi Yu know that she was not your biological sister when she was alive?" Yi Feng was stunned and frowned. She should have known? What do you mean by should have? Did you tell her that clearly? Did you tell her that you picked her up? Yi Feng paused for a moment and shook his head slowly. No. I was afraid that I would hurt her, so I did not tell her about it. Ning Xuemore, she tilted her head and thought for a moment. Then, she looked at Yi Feng with a complicated look. She wanted to say something, but she did not say it in the end. A question flashed through her mind. Was it possible that Yi Yu had always thought that Yi Feng was her biological brother, but when she found out that she had feelings that she shouldn't have for her biological brother, She was shocked and desperately tried to find someone else to entrust her feelings to. Coincidentally, that man had arrived, and he had that charming temperament that made Yi Yu think that he was her Prince Charming. Therefore, she left with that man without hesitation. However, after they got ashore, the more time she spent with that man, the more she missed her brother. She unintentionally revealed these traces in certain places. That man's family didn't allow Yi Yu to become the official wife. Perhaps this was exactly what she wanted. She took the opportunity to return to the sea and look for her brother. However, she found out that her brother was already engaged to another woman. She was heartbroken and despaired. She was also embarrassed. Perhaps the Sharkmen clan had really become a sad place for her. That was why she decided to change into another person and end everything once and for all. She did not expect that the operation would fail. She was tortured for 2 days in vain and finally died an unnatural death. If her relationship with Yi Feng was just a normal sibling relationship, then she was the one who had wronged Yi Feng first. Moreover, she was the one who requested to change into another person. Even if the operation failed, she should be grateful to him and not hate him. Listening to her last words, she obviously hated him. Of course, these were all Ning Xuemo's guesses. As for the truth, only Yi Yu probably knew about it. It was a pity that Yi Yu was dead, and Yang Ziyuan did not have the memory of being Yi Yu. Therefore, what happened back then would probably remain a mystery forever. She looked at Yi Feng again. Yi Feng looked up at the starry sky in the distance. He looked a little lonely. Chapter 660. Yi Feng, what do you plan to do in the future? After this encounter, Yi Feng had remained in his mermaid form. He must have been severely injured, causing him to be unable to maintain his human form. In this state, it was impossible for him to stay by Yang Ziyuan's side. Yi Feng lowered his eyes and didn't say anything. She was about to marry the man she loved, so she didn't need him to stay by her side any longer, right? And where do you plan to go? Go where? Ning Xuemo's cat eyes narrowed. With that forbidden technique, she could no longer return to the mermaid clan. She could only wander about. The atmosphere was a bit heavy. Ning Xuemo decided to change the topic. Yi Feng, what about your fiancée? Will you go back and reunite with her this time? Yi Feng shook his head. After Yi Yu died, I had no intention of marrying, so I cancelled the engagement. She should have married someone else. While the two of them were talking, the fish were finished as well. Miss Ning, after you escaped this time, do you know of Carefree Island? Yi Feng seemed a bit confused. Carefree Island? Is it an island? Ning Xuemo nodded. It is an island. The island master is Rong Yueshenlan. She should be an immortal doctor, and her appearance-changing technique is quite good. There are tropical plants growing all over the island, such as coconut trees. There is also a large tree whose leaves are golden and hexagonal. She tried her best to describe the plants on the island, hoping that Yi Feng would say he recognized them. Her soul was imprisoned in this cat's body. According to Yi Qingwan, she couldn't use suicide to escape. Otherwise, her soul would scatter. Yi Qingwan might not be speaking the truth. Perhaps she was only trying to scare her, but she couldn't help but be on guard. She hadn't lived long enough. She didn't want to die like this. Yi Qingwan's technique was simply too wicked. Moreover, with her current cultivation, she was indeed able to do so. She feared that an ordinary person wouldn't be able to solve this technique. She could only ask the immortal Rong Yueshenlan for help. If Rong Yueshenlan also didn't have any methods, she could only ask Great God Han for help. Moreover, Ning Xuemo's original body was still at Carefree Island. Thus, no matter what, she had to make a trip there. Which sea is this island in? Yi Feng asked. He had been wandering the world for a long time and was very familiar with the layout of this continent, but he had never heard of such an island, nor had he heard of Rongyue Tianlan. In this world, the continent was a single piece of land surrounded by oceans. The ocean covered the largest area. No one knew how big the ocean was. Even the Sharkmen, Yi Feng, didn't know. Ning Xuemo felt that the map of this world was rather similar to that of Earth. In ancient times, the continents were a single piece. Later, with the changes in the Earth's crust, The continents drifted apart, because it was surrounded by the ocean, but the name was different. For example, the Rakshasa Sea to the south, the Netherworld Sea to the north, the Floating Dream Sea to the east, and the Sunset Sea to the west. Yi Feng's mermaid clan was located in the southern Rakshasa Sea. He was still very familiar with the Rakshasa Sea and was very familiar with the islands inside. But he had never heard of Carefree Island. As for the island plants that Ning Xuemore described, they seemed to only exist on the islands of the Rakshasa Sea. Ning Xuemore was surprised by his question. When she went to Carefree Island, it was Han Shanyu who had brought her there. At that time, she had slept in the carriage for a long time before arriving at a seaside. How could she have seen what kind of sea it was? However, she finally remembered the small city that she had stayed in at the time. She had started from that small city and walked for about a day before arriving at the seaside. This sea shouldn't be too far from that small city. Chapter 661. Ning Xuemore told him the name of the small city. Yi Feng actually knew the name of the small city. He was surprised. That small city is an inland city. It's 2,000 miles away from the nearest sea. You actually managed to get there in a single day, 2,000 miles. Princess Mingwan's carriage was pulled by horses that were 1 in a million, but to travel 2,000 miles in a single day was still a fantasy. It was simply impossible. Moreover, when she was sitting in the carriage, she didn't feel any bumps. The only possibility was that Han Shanyu had secretly done something to the carriage so that no one noticed. No, that carriage boy seemed to have noticed something. Ning Xuemore remembered that when she got off the carriage, she saw that the boy's expression was a bit strange. It was just that she was in a hurry to go to Carefree Island, so she didn't pay too much attention to his expression. That carriage boy was Princess Mingwan's servant after all. His ability to remain calm wasn't ordinary, so his surprise wasn't obvious. If Han Shanyu had used some sort of technique along the way, then she really wouldn't know which sea it was. Then let's go to the beach closest to the small city. Ning Xuemore said. She could only choose to try her luck. She looked at Yi Feng. How far is that place from here? Yi Feng raised his hand and rubbed between his eyebrows. About 8,000 miles, Ning Xuemore. Her soul had actually floated so far away. She was about to say something when the sound of flapping wings came from the sky. There was no lack of birds in the mountains, but this sound was obviously that of a large bird of prey. Moreover, there were 4 or 5 of them together. Ning Xuemore's heart sank. She looked up and saw several large birds flying towards them from the distance. There were people sitting on the backs of the birds, and there was a cold glint in their eyes. Yi Feng's eyes were sharp. He saw the clothes of the people sitting on the backs of the birds. Bright reverence. Pursuers. He didn't think that even though they had escaped so far away, Yi Qingwan still didn't want to let them go. She had actually sent pursuers all the way here. Without hesitation, Yi Feng picked up the cat and dived back into the water. There were so many forks and waterways, and so many mazes, but Yi Qingwan could still chase them all the way here. It seemed that she had some skills. What kind of tracking technique did she use? He must have used some kind of magical treasure or animal. Otherwise, she wouldn't have caught up so quickly. Yi Feng, what's the fastest tracking species in the water? Ning Xuemore asked. Only by knowing yourself and your enemy can you win 100 battles. Yi Feng pondered for a moment and immediately said, I'm afraid she has Wenshin fish. Ning Xuemore stared at him with wide eyes. Yi Feng took a deep breath and briefly explained the origin of the Wenshin fish to her. This was a type of fish that was comparable to hunting dogs. They were best at tracking in the water. They could determine the size of the object they were tracking based on the aura in the water. Therefore, when encountering them, any illusion would be useless. However, this type of fish was extremely rare. Even Yi Feng, as the king of the marine species, had never gotten his hands on one before. Someone once speculated that this fish had gone extinct, but he didn't expect Yi Qingwan to have one. This was beyond Yi Feng's expectation. What's their weakness? Are they afraid of poison? Yi Feng smiled bitterly. No. They are not afraid of any poison. Ning Xuemore couldn't think of a way to avoid being tracked by this fish. Moreover, that fish was most likely beside Yi Qingwan. She couldn't assassinate that fish. Chapter 662. Yi Feng hugged the cat and ran along the waterway towards the direction of Carefree Island, Carefree Island. Inside the cleansing room, the mud was still tumbling, and the mud shell was still moving up and down. Rong Yueshenlan stood at the entrance of the hall, staring at the enchantment that had sealed Ning Xuemor's soul. How could this be? How could this be? He had set up this enchantment to trap souls. Even the most powerful ghost in the world wouldn't be able to break it. Ning Xuemor was only an ordinary person. How could her soul have escaped? 6 hours ago, he had received news that Ning Xuemor had come to visit. Since Ning Xuemor was fine, he felt relieved and went out to greet her. Originally, he had wanted to settle Yunqi down and then return to guard her. However, he hadn't expected that Yunqi had suffered a qi deviation while cultivating. She had been seriously injured and had struggled to find him. Naturally, he couldn't ignore the life and death of his good friend. He had no choice but to immediately heal her. This delay lasted for nearly 6 hours. After 6 hours, he had finally stabilized Yunqi's injuries. Just as he was about to go and see how Ning Xuemor was doing, he saw Diizwe appear in his hall. Han Shanyu looked a little tired and his face was a little pale. When Yunqi saw him, her expression changed slightly. She stood up and bowed to him. Diizwe. Han Shanyu only nodded slightly. He didn't have any intention of talking to her. He directly asked Rong Yueshenlan, "Where is she?" Rong Yueshenlan naturally knew who he was referring to. He sighed and briefly told him about how Ning Xuemor's leg hadn't recovered. Of course, he also told him about his method. When he had told him about it, he had been immensely proud of himself. However, he didn't expect that Han Shanyue's expression would change before he could finish. He coldly said, "Nonsense." With a turn of his body, he disappeared, heading straight for his clean room. Rong Yueshenlan saw that his expression wasn't right and his heart skipped a beat. Although he didn't understand why Han Shanyu was so nervous, he faintly felt that something was wrong. He hurriedly followed behind. He didn't expect that when he opened the door and saw everything inside, he would be stunned. The mud shell that contained Ning Xuemor's body was still rolling, but the soul that he had sealed was nowhere to be found. Han Shanyu was a man of action. When Rong Yu Tianlan arrived, he had already begun to use the spirit summoning spell to summon Ning Xuemor's soul back. However, to his surprise, his soul summoning spell, which had always worked, did not work. After the spell was cast, he did not even manage to summon half of Ning Xuemor's soul. There were only 3 reasons for this to happen. First, her soul had already dissipated. Secondly, her soul was attached to something else. Thirdly, she had already reincarnated. It was impossible for her to reincarnate in such a short period of time. She was a living soul, not a dead soul. It was impossible for the underworld to accept her. There were only 2 possibilities left. Han Shanyue's face was slightly pale. His eyes stared at Rong Yueshenlan, who was still in a state of shock. He didn't speak for a long time. Rong Yueshenlan was frightened by his stare. He took a deep breath and said, "Diizwe, I am also very surprised that this happened. I clearly sealed her in the force field. How did it disappear? It was impossible. It was really impossible. It was too strange. When did Yunqi arrive?" Han Shanyu suddenly asked. Rong Yueshenlan's expression changed slightly. He naturally understood what Han Shanyu was suspecting. Diizwe, Yunqi arrived 6 hours ago. Chapter 663. Yunqi was seriously injured because of qi deviation. Since I met her, I have been treating her injuries. She has never left my sight, Rong Yueshenlan continued. In other words, the possibility of Yunqi secretly attacking them had been eliminated. Han Shanyu nodded slightly. At this time, Han Shanyu was not afraid of offending people. He wanted to investigate all possibilities in order to find Ning Xuemor's soul in the shortest time possible. The longer this went on, the more disadvantageous it would be for her. Rong Yueshenlan, did anyone else come to your island in the past 6 hours? Rong Yueshenlan shook his head. No. Only Yunqi. Of course, He could sense his own island. Not to mention one more person, even if there was one more mouse on this island, he could sense it. This eliminated all external factors. It seemed like Ning Shuamore had broken the force field and left for some unknown reason. That brat, couldn't she just leave him alone and not worry about her? Tell me the details of what happened. Don't leave anything out, Han Shanyu said. This was not the time to find fault with anyone. The most important thing was to find her soul. He and Rongi Weshanlan had known each other for thousands of years, so he knew his temper well. He wouldn't harm Ning Shuamore for Yunqi's sake and scatter that girl's soul. As for Ning Shuamore, she was an expert at breaking barriers. He didn't expect that she would be restless even in her soul state. Rongi Weshanlan did not delay and immediately told him everything that had happened after Ning Shuamore ran out to find him. In the end, he said, "Di Zwe, I know this method is very dangerous, but Miss Ning insisted on recovering her legs. I had no choice. I tried to contact Di Zwe, but I could not reach him." Rome Yutian also felt a little bitter in his heart. Who did he offend? He had good intentions, but he did not expect this to happen. Moreover, Di Zwe did not tell him the whole story and ran away. He did not even mention his whereabouts, so he could not contact him. Miss Ning might be angry with him. He coughed and said, "Di Zwe, forgive me for being nosy, but you two are newlyweds. Early in the morning, you left her behind without saying a word, so we couldn't contact you even if we wanted to. I saw that Miss Ning seemed to be a bit resentful. Will her soul disappear in a fit of anger and make you anxious?" Han Shanyu paused. "She's not as bored as you. She had resentment. I should be the one with resentment, right?" He couldn't do anything on their wedding night. In order to restore her appearance, he even accepted Rongyue Tianlan's wicked method and almost got seriously injured. In the end, when that lass woke up, she still acted as if they were going their separate ways. She kept calling herself his shield and concubine. If he really treated her as a shield, he wouldn't have helped her so much. Moreover, he didn't need a shield. Ever since he had met Shuemore, his peaceful life had been disrupted. Things kept happening, and he had never had a moment of peace. Because that girl's feet had been seriously injured once, she had used the Chilean armor to treat them and changed her original genes. Therefore, she could not use normal methods to recover them. Other parts of her body had been restored, but her legs had changed. He was also heartbroken when he saw it. After her disguise was removed, she slept soundly with drool dripping from her mouth. He did not sleep at all, but read medical books. Finally, he found out in a medical book that the soft armor flower of the morning and evening mountain could restore the body's elements changed by the Chilean armor. He wanted to wait until she woke up and realized that her feet were not right before telling her about it. Then, he told her to wait patiently while he went to the morning and evening mountain to get the herbs for her. Chapter 664. Han Shanyu didn't expect the little bastard to touch her body after she woke up. Her actions were so bold and shameless that it was an eye-opener for him. He simply didn't speak and didn't make a sound. He wanted to see where Ning Shuamore's bottom line was. He was such a big living person lying next to her, but she actually ignored him. She only noticed him when she was about to get up. Seeing that she was afraid that he would touch her, he was so angry that he decided to just disappear. He knew that when Shuamore found out that her feet were like that, she would be anxious and helpless. Then, let her be anxious for a while. Consider it a punishment for her. Of course, he wouldn't really leave her alone. He recovered a little and went straight to Zhaoxi Mountain to pick some grass. Zhaoxi Mountain was a mountain in the demon realm. It wasn't in this world, but in a barrier. Ferocious beasts and demons ran rampant there. Even with his skills, he had to be careful. In order to avoid alerting the demons in Zhaoxi Mountain, he turned off all the sound-transmitting spells on him. This was also the main reason why Rong Yuishan couldn't contact him. What Han Shanyu didn't expect was that Rong Yuishan actually had another way to heal Shuamore's feet. He didn't expect this method to be so perverted. Of course, he didn't expect such an accident to happen. Every soul moved based on their thoughts. However, after a normal soul left the body, it would be muddle-headed and wouldn't know where it was, let alone who it was. Of course, it wouldn't know what to do. This kind of soul would either stay in the same place after leaving the body or follow its own body. There were also some souls that couldn't support the shape and scattered. Very few souls with strong willpower would wander around, such as this troublesome girl. Where's that Kirin? Han Shanue's tone was very bad. It's here. Kirin came in from outside the door and looked at Han Shanyu timidly. Where did you go just now? Why didn't you stay by her side? Han Shanue's face was as calm as water. There were several times when Ning Shuamore was in trouble because this unreliable Kirin wasn't by her side. Just now, Island Master Rongyue and my master were playing chess. I was bored, so I went to the lake to cultivate. Kirin stammered. The lake water here was full of spiritual energy, making it a good place for cultivation. Therefore, it went straight into the water to cultivate. It had lost track of time in there. By the time it was done and came out, Han Shanyu and the others were already there. This unreliable Kirin really needs to be taught a lesson. However, now was not the time to teach it a lesson. Quickly use your telepathy to sense your master and find out where she is, Han Shanyu ordered. As long as Ning Shuamore was within a range of 1,000 miles, Kirin would be able to sense her. No matter what she foolishly possessed, it would be able to find her quickly and bring her back. Kirin's head drooped. I tried to sense it just now, but I couldn't. It was on the verge of tears. Han Shanyu was speechless. Her soul was already thousands of miles away. How did she run away? Could it be that she was cultivating the will soul? Wherever her will went, her soul would go there instantly. Han Shanyu lowered his eyes and thought for a moment. His fingers slowly clenched. He thought of the illusion Ning Shuamore's will soul in the belly of the mountain spirit. Her willpower was indeed extraordinarily strong. Then, where did her soul go after breaking through this enchantment? Chapter 665. So where did Shuamore's soul want to go after breaking through this enchantment? Could it be, she wanted to go back to her era? No. Her original body was still here. Logically speaking, her soul couldn't leave this world without a special reason. So where did she want to go? Kirin couldn't be contacted, which meant that she was thousands of miles away. Her soul could play chess with Rongyu and be on par with her, which meant that her mind wasn't in a mess. She should be very clear-headed. She wouldn't have lost her soul for no reason. So the disappearance of her soul could be dispelled. What was left was that she had possessed something else. But her willpower was so strong, and she knew that her body could be healed, so she shouldn't have thought of possessing something else. Even if she was curious and found a cat or a dog to possess, once she felt that something was wrong, she could immediately use suicide to escape. But now she couldn't come out, so she should be restrained by some kind of spell. There weren't many people on this continent who knew this kind of spell. They could be counted with one hand. Han Shanyu reached out and took out a golden talisman, and opened the heavenly sound wall again. He was always straightforward when giving orders. Order the disciples to investigate the heavenly star sect, limitless sect. Bright reverence. See if there are any movements from these sects in the past few hours. It had to be said that the Sun-Moon sect's disciples were very informative. After half an hour, there was finally a reply from the other side, reporting to Ancestor, 4 hours ago, there was a strange movement from the Bright Reverence cult. They seemed to be chasing after a mermaid and a cat. Even the leader of the Bright Reverence cult, Yi Qinghuan, personally went after them. The voice transmitted from the golden talisman was heard by everyone present. Rongyu Tianlan was stunned, and looked at Han Shanyu with a complicated gaze. It can't be? Bright Reverence is more than 8,000 miles away from here. Miss Ning's soul can float there? Maybe it's just a coincidence. Han Shanyu was expressionless. He stood there for a moment, then suddenly raised his hand, and a white light appeared around him. When the white light dissipated, his entire appearance had changed. She wore a loose white robe that fluttered in the wind. Her fine black hair fell to her ankles like a waterfall. Her face was covered with a cold jade mask, and a sparkling sapphire hung on her forehead. He stood there like a god who had descended to the mortal world. Kirin stared blankly. You. Ancestor. Han Shanyu glanced at it. He did not expect it to have seen his true appearance. However, it wasn't strange. In this continent, his signature clothes were almost always the symbol of the venerable emperor. Kirin might have heard of it before, which was why he could recognize it immediately. Looks like this little guy's IQ isn't that low after all. Before he could finish his thought, Kirin had already spoken. Great God, you actually want to impersonate Di Zun? Wouldn't it be easier to save my master by impersonating him? Han Sha knew. He was too lazy to talk nonsense with the little Chelin. He raised his hand, and a white light enveloped the little Chelin. The little Chelin cried out in alarm, and after the white light dispersed, an angry blue cat was standing on the ground. The little Chelin was simply furious. When it wanted to turn into a cat, Han Shanyu disliked it so much that it didn't dare to appear in front of him in its cat form. What was wrong with him now? He actually turned it into a cat. It angrily wanted to change back, but after a while, it was useless. It was shocked. Hey, great God Han, what are you doing? He won't turn me into a cat forever, right? Chapter 666. Han Shanyu waved his sleeves and picked up the blue cat. Come with me. After another gust of wind, Han Shanyu was nowhere to be seen. Rongi Weshenlan was speechless. Di Zue had broken the precept. The emperor had exposed his true identity in front of Kirin. Di Zue had even used the instant travel technique. This technique wasn't something that could be mastered by people on this continent. If outsiders found out, it would cause a huge commotion. Di Zue was really nervous about Miss Ning. He suddenly sensed something and turned his head to look at the entrance of the hall. He saw Yunqi standing there. Her face was pale and her eyes were blank as she stood there in a daze. The wind blew her clothes and made her flutter. She was so weak that it seemed like a gust of wind could blow her away. Yunqi, your body isn't well. Why are you here instead of meditating in the front hall? Rongi Weshenlan's heart sank when he saw her expression. He walked over to her. He really cares about her, doesn't he? Yunqi's voice was a little shaky. Rongi Weshenlan sighed. He paused and finally said, Yunqi, I think you should give up. Give up? Yunqi repeated mechanically. Her voice suddenly rose. Why should I? Why should I give up? I've been waiting for him for thousands of years. Why should that woman? She's just a mortal. Her voice was shrill. How can I not compare to her? Why? Why can't he see me? Among all the women around him, I'm the most special to him. This was the first time she'd screamed without caring about her image. Her face was green and white. Rongi Weshenlan frowned. His figure flashed and he appeared in front of Yunqi. He tapped her shoulder with the tip of his fan. Yunqi's body swayed and she spat out a mouthful of blood. Rongi Weshenlan heaved a sigh of relief and helped her sit down on a chair. Yunqi, you almost went berserk again. If he hadn't intervened in time, Yunqi's recuperated meridians would have gone astray again. Yunqi was stunned for a moment. Suddenly, tears streamed down her face. Rongi Weshenlan, what should I do? Rongi Weshenlan sighed. His answer was straightforward. You should let go. Feelings can't be forced. Let go. How could this be? I've waited for him for thousands of years. Yunqi, if he is heartless towards you, what's the point of waiting for him for 10,000 years? Feelings were not determined by the number of years they had known each other. Yunqi, if you continue to be stubborn, I'm afraid you'll be the one getting hurt in the end. But I can't accept it. I'm obviously better than that woman in every way. Yunqi's gaze fell on the mud shell that was still rolling in the mud. Rome Yutian gently closed her fan and said, when it comes to love, it doesn't have to be a match. If it was all about matching in social status and skills, then how could there be so many infatuated men and resentful women and beautiful love stories in this world? But this woman really doesn't deserve him. Chapter 667. Rongyue Tianlan interrupted Yunqi with a serious look in her eyes. Di Zue has the final say on whether or not she is worthy of him. No one else has the right to judge. As for her lifespan of a few hundred years, if she cultivates, she might even live for 1,000 years. Even if she only has the lifespan of an ordinary person, what are you worried about? It's only a few decades or a few hundred years. If you really can't let go, why not wait a few hundred years? These words enlightened Yunshi, and her eyes lit up slightly. Yes, Ning Xuemore was only an ordinary person. Even if she married the Dizwe, she could only accompany him for a few hundred years. Maybe this woman was nothing and only had a few decades of lifespan. There was nothing to be afraid of. She then looked at the mud shell in the medicinal paste. This body was just an ordinary human body. A beautiful woman would age easily, and she would die in the blink of an eye. Maybe she would really become an old lady in a few decades. However, the Dizwe didn't age. Maybe in a few decades, he would get tired of this woman and abandon her. Yunshi, on the other hand, was immortal. As long as she scrupulously behaved as a friend, the Dizwe would still treat her as a good friend. She still had a chance. She didn't dare to have any ideas about destroying Ning Xuemore's body. Firstly, Rongyue Tianlan wouldn't allow it. Secondly, she didn't want to risk offending the Dizwe. Great God Han, where are you taking me? Kirin was carried in Han Shanyue's hand. The scenery in front of her flashed past her at the speed of light. She couldn't see anything clearly. This person was too hateful. Everyone else was carrying a cat, but he was carrying a cat. It was as if he was carrying a pile of trash, which made her very uncomfortable. From now on, call me the Dizwe, Han Shanyu instructed. Are you really going to pretend to be the Dizwe? If the disciples of the Sun Moon sect find out, you will be hunted down, Kirin reminded him. Shut up. Just do as I say. Han Shanyu was originally a person who didn't want to explain. Moreover, the person he needed to explain to was a silly Kirin. He didn't have the patience to do so. Fine. Kirin shut up. After holding it in for a while, it couldn't hold it in anymore and asked, Great God Han, did you also hear that the ancestor and Yi Qingwan have that kind of thing? So you deliberately pretended to be her master to scare her? Han Shanyu was speechless. He paused for a moment and almost threw the little Chelin who was spreading gossip out. Who said that I have any passion with Yi Qingwan? She was only once my disciple. This master Han really got into the mood quickly. Pretending to be a venerable sovereign, he immediately spoke in the tone of a venerable sovereign. TSK, Great God Han, to be honest, you're not the ancestor himself. How would you know that there's nothing going on between the ancestor and Yi Qingwan? Even if there was something going on, they wouldn't tell you, right? Kirin said with a knowing look. Han Shanyu glanced at the Kirin and began to consider the possibility of throwing this 8 trigrams Kirin out. He suddenly thought of something. Did your master say that? With Kirin's intelligence, it shouldn't have thought so much, and it also shouldn't know so much. Kirin had been with Ning Xuemore for the longest time, so it was most likely that Ning Xuemore, that little bastard, made this up. Kirin looked at him with shining eyes. Great God, you're really smart. Sure enough. He guessed right. Chapter 668. That girl didn't have much contact with his true self, but she began to pay attention to his gossip. Was she interested in his true self? Han Shanyue's eyes flashed. What did your master say? Hey, it's rare for the great god to ask about gossip. Kirin immediately cheered up. My master said that the ancestor and his disciple most likely had a passionate relationship. Yi Qingwan liked him, and he also liked Yi Qingwan. However, due to their master and disciple status, this kind of taboo love was not appreciated by the common people. The master and disciple went through some hardships, and the ancestor reluctantly cut off their relationship and banished his female disciple. The female disciple sadly left and established the Bright Reverence sect. Bright Reverence, isn't that the combination of the sun and the moon? Only she still considered herself as the ancestor's disciple. After the ancestor banished her, he secretly promised that Yi Qingwan would be his only female disciple, and that he would not accept a second one. Although the master and disciple did not meet, in their hearts, they recognized each other as the one and only. It's sad and beautiful, right? Han Shanyu, sad and beautiful? It's more like a bastard. With his temperament, if he really liked someone, why would he care about the taboo love between master and disciple? Why would he make himself so miserable? To him, all rules and regulations were fleeting cloud. That girl was simply too much of a bastard. She randomly made up stories about him. Did she say all this? Han Shanue's voice was cold. My master explained it to me, Kirin explained. In fact, it still remembered Ning Xuemo's words. It was just that a few days ago, Ning Xuemo was very bored and told it a story. Somehow, the topic was brought up to the ancestor and Yi Qingwan. Ning Xuemo just casually said, "The relationship between the master and disciple is not simple." At that time, Kirin asked why. Ning Xuemo smiled and said, "I've only heard of a master-disciple relationship. I didn't expect to see a real-life version of it in this world." The little Chelene was not ashamed to ask questions. It immediately asked about the relationship between a master and a disciple. Ning Xuemo explained to it about the romance between a master and a disciple that she had read in her era. She told it about quite a few novels, and each one of them was filled with passion and emotion. She was just speaking casually. Kirin was, after all, still young and ignorant of these matters. It was just listening to her. After hearing about it, he had pretty much forgotten about it. Now that Han Shanyu mentioned it, it summarized Ning Xuemo's story into the story of Di Zun and Yi Qingwan with a deep expression. "Your master really has a lot of free time." Han Shanue's voice was cold. No wonder that Lass said that master-disciple relationship was the most annoying thing in front of him. It turned out that she had a preconceived impression of it. My master is not free. It's just that her deductive ability is very strong. What she deduces can't be wrong. Di Zun and his apprentice must be in a master-disciple relationship. Kirin concluded. Han Shanue's lips curled up coldly. Since that Lass said that he was in a master-disciple relationship, perhaps he should make it true. Let her have a taste of it herself. He really should take in another female apprentice. Originally, because of the shadow of Yi Qingwan, he was afraid that he would encounter similar troubles again. Therefore, he did not take in any female apprentices. He did not expect that Ning Xuemo would make up such a melodramatic drama for him. Great God, Han! Kirin was about to say something else, but it was interrupted by Han Shanyu. Call him Di Zun. Chapter 669. Alright, Di Zun is Di Zun. Di Zun, how do you think my master went to Yi Qingwan's place? Han Shanyu was speechless. How would you know? He also wanted to know the answer to this question. Could it be that the girl was very interested in him and misunderstood that he had feelings for Yi Qingwan, so she wanted to take a look? Stop talking nonsense. Pay more attention to your master. We have now covered more than half of the distance. She is escaping again. If you can sense her, we will be really close. Okay. Kirin nodded and used his telepathy to call Ning Xuemo again and again. Over there. Over there. Ah, she dived into the water again. Quick. Quick, report it to the leader. It seemed that Yi Qingwan really hated Ning Xuemo to the extreme. All the disciples of the Bright Reverence sect were actually chasing after her. Because of the tracking of the letterfish, they were able to determine the general route that Ning Xuemo and Yi Feng escaped. Therefore, they rode all kinds of big birds in the air and looked down on the ground. It was almost a carpet search. Therefore, when Yi Feng brought Ning Xuemo to the surface of the water to change the air bubbles, they would occasionally be discovered by them. Then, they would quickly inform Yi Qingwan, who was following them underground through the voice transmission talisman. With this guidance, Yi Qingwan naturally got closer and closer. After all, Yi Feng was once the leader of the Sharkmen and was also a secret guard. He was naturally sensitive to danger. Although he had not met Yi Qingwan yet, he had already accurately grasped the danger. Ning Xuemo was also a secret agent, so she was naturally very sensitive to danger. She could not sense the outside world in the air bubble, but she could feel Yi Feng's nervousness. Is she about to catch up? Ning Xuemo asked. Yes. About a few dozen miles of water. With Yi Qingwan's martial arts, she could reach here in a few minutes. At this speed, Yi Qingwan would be able to catch up with them in about an hour. Once they caught up to him, he would be doomed. Yi Feng would be skinned alive, and Ning Xuemo's soul would probably be torn into 8 pieces by Yi Qingwan. If an ordinary warrior were to encounter such a situation, they would have been scared out of their wits. They would either run around like headless flies, or they would not be able to bear the psychological pressure and fight to the death with the other party. Even if they knew that they were no match for the other party, they would die a quick death. However, Yi Feng was different. Years of living on the edge of a knife and blood had trained his mental fortitude to be extraordinarily strong. He was already seriously injured, and after being tortured by Yi Qinghuan for so long, his physical strength was less than half of his original. Now that they had been on the run for so long, they were exhausted. Even so, his expression remained calm, and he didn't seem to panic at all during his escape. Although Ning Xuemore was in the bubble, she was still in his arms, so she could feel his steady heartbeat. Yi Feng was really a talent. It was a pity that Yang Ziyuan only had Jiyu Xian in her eyes. Her feelings were all on Jiyu Xian, but she always neglected the lover who was silently accompanying her. Love was like this. You put in a lot, but you might not get what you want. Others might not necessarily respond to you. She shook her head. Now was not the time to think about love. It was more important to escape. Escaping like this was not a solution. She had to think of another way. There was another fork in the road. Ning Xuemore's heart couldn't help but move. Chapter 670. Ning Xuemore said in a low voice, Yi Feng, you should take a slightly narrower path like before. After about 1 mile, you should immediately turn back and try to take the roundabout path. Yi Feng was stunned. He was also a person who understood things quickly, so he immediately understood Ning Xuemore's idea. His eyes lit up slightly. Okay. It was the first time in Yi Qinghuan's life that she chased someone without caring about the cost. It was also the first time she met someone so cunning and so difficult to chew. The other party was just a heavily injured sharkman and a cat that didn't know anything. She had used so many disciples and the most precious wenchen fish. With such a large formation, she could even catch up to a peerless master. But now, after chasing for so long, she still didn't see the other party's shadow. If it wasn't for the disciples on the ground reporting to her from time to time, and the wenchen fish guiding the direction from time to time, she would have thought that she was chasing in the wrong direction. The wenchen fish had the ability to judge the general distance based on the aura of the person being tracked. She knew that she was indeed getting closer and closer. There was another fork in the road ahead. The wenchen fish paused for a moment, then chose one. Yi Qinghuan entered without thinking. Because every time the wenchen fish followed the aura, it would consume its own physical strength. Yi Qinghuan had chased it for so long that it was already very tired. Yi Qinghuan wanted to maintain its physical strength. Usually, she would only release the wenchen fish when she encountered a fork in the road or needed to determine the general distance from the other party. So when she entered the fork again, she put away the wenchen fish and hurriedly chased forward. Although there were many forks in the underground water vein, this one was especially long. Yi Qinghuan chased forward for more than 200 miles before another fork in the road appeared in front of her. She released the wenchen fish. This time, the wenchen fish sniffed at the fork for a few minutes, but it still couldn't find the aura of Yi Feng. How could he have chased her away? Yi Qinghuan didn't believe it. She thought that there was something wrong with the wenchen fish's sense of smell. She used her own aura to test the wenchen fish. The wenchen fish's location was still very accurate. This meant that it wasn't the wenchen fish's fault. There was no sign of Yi Feng and the others at any of the forks in front of her. Even the path she was on now did not have them. There was only one reason for this. Yi Feng and the others turned back not long after they entered the fork in the road. However, she managed to catch up with him. She had been fooled. Yi Qinghuan was so angry that her hands trembled slightly. She had never suffered such a huge loss in all the years she had been in the industry. She hated Yi Feng and Ning Xuemore so much that her hair stood on end. If curses could kill, Yi Feng and Ning Xuemore would have been cursed to death by her many times. She walked back for more than 200 miles before she smelled Yi Feng's scent again. As a result, time was delayed even further. In addition, the auras of the waterways Yi Feng had traveled were similar. He had brought Ning Xuemore along with him. Once they had retraced their steps, their auras were almost the same. It would be difficult for the Wenchen fish to distinguish between the two. It couldn't judge by the size of the aura of the person it was tracking. It also had to calculate which path had the freshest aura to determine where they had gone. However, Yifeng and the others were very fast. The freshness of the auras on these paths was not much different. It had to use all of its tactile abilities to analyze and judge. As a result, not only did the Wenchen fish consume a lot of energy, it also slowed down significantly. Chapter 671. The distance between them increased again. Yi Qinghuan was so angry that she wanted to stomp her feet. Seeing that her precious fish was getting more and more tired and weak, she was angry and anxious, but she could not think of a solution. Those two people were very cunning. Often, after entering a fork in the road, they would go back the way they came from. The path they took was like a maze, making her feel dizzy. Even worse, their way of walking made it impossible for Yi Qinghuan to put away the Wenchen fish. She could only let the fish lead the way. The Wenchen fish also had a physical limit. It was getting weaker and weaker, and its analysis of breath was getting slower and slower. Being led by the nose like this was not a solution. Yi Qinghuan's eyes flashed fiercely. She had to make another move. Today, if she did not catch the mermaid and the cat and tear them into pieces, her name Yi Qinghuan would be written upside down. She immediately contacted the disciples outside and asked them to bring the treasure of the sect, the Tianji network. This kind of running consumed a lot of energy. Yifeng also used up a lot of energy. His dark blue scales were slightly white, which was a sign that he was about to reach his limit. But fortunately, he could sense that Yi Qinghuan was getting further and further away from him. Ning Xuemo's maze was obviously making the woman suffer. Yifeng was so tired that the tip of his tail was numb, but he still gritted his teeth and persisted. He was a member of the water clan, so he naturally knew the characteristics of the Wenchen fish. He knew that chasing the Wenchen fish like this would be tiring. At this speed, if he persisted for another 2 hours, the Wenchen fish would most likely be completely destroyed. Only when the Wenchen fish was truly destroyed, Yi Qinghuan would have lost her tracking eyes. He had to carry Ning Xuemo and run forward. Only then could he truly shake her off and escape with his life. He looked down at Ning Xuemo in his arms, and a touch of admiration flashed through his eyes. Ning Xuemo was the one who came up with these ideas during the escape. All of these methods were absolutely effective. She was just a teenage girl, but she was actually more experienced than him, a merman who had been through a lot. Those tricks were too much for him to take in. This girl was definitely different. Even the old foxes in Jianghu did not have as many ideas as her. Was she really the rumored young miss of the Marquis's estate who never left her home? It was impossible for someone who had not experienced too many life and death situations to have such precise judgment and battle experience. Because the distance between them had increased again, Yifeng was finally able to calm down a little and slow down a little. "Miss Ning, do you have another identity?" Yifeng asked. Ning Xuemo was calculating the general distance between her and Yi Qinghuan and the consumption speed of the Wenchen fish. Hearing his question, she answered absent-mindedly. Have you ever been a scout, assassin, or secret guard? If she had done any of these, she would definitely be one of the best. Yifeng wasn't simple. He actually saw through her true identity. Although Ning Xuemo and Yifeng had not known each other for a long time, she already knew his temperament and knew that he was a chivalrous person. This kind of person was a good friend to have. Ning Xuemo did not want to hide anything from him, so she told him about her previous life's identity. Of course, because of time constraints, she was very brief. Even so, it was enough to shock Yifeng. So she had reincarnated in someone else's body. He was very knowledgeable and naturally knew what reincarnating in someone else's body was. Chapter 672. In fact, it was not easy to succeed in reincarnation. Every body corresponded to a soul, and the body was like a container for the soul. Only one's own body was the most suitable one. When borrowing someone else's body, the body and soul were mostly incompatible. It was actually very risky for the soul to reincarnate. If it failed, the soul would scatter. Even if one could successfully reincarnate, the soul would feel very uncomfortable in the borrowed body, and it would not be easy to command the body. Often, its movements would be stiff, like a jumping zombie. There were also very few souls that had strong adaptability and could command the body as they wished. But after all, compared to their original body, their lifespan would be greatly shortened. This was also the main reason why the souls that Yi Qinghuan made for this cat could age so quickly. Although Yi Qinghuan had used a spell on the cat to allow all kinds of souls to enter and adapt to it, Yi Qinghuan was still unable to do so. But it was very harmful to those souls. Often, the soul of a young girl would become the soul of a 70 or 80-year-old woman after 10 years or so. The power of the soul would be almost completely absorbed by this cat's body. Yi Feng had seen Ning Xuemo's original appearance before, and her movements were not ordinary, and she did not have the slightest sluggishness of a reincarnated soul. If Ning Xuemo did not say it herself, Yi Feng might not be able to guess it even if he guessed for 1,000 years. Reincarnation was an extremely confidential matter, and even one's own relatives might not know about it. He did not expect Ning Xuemo to say it to him without hesitation. Yi Feng was surprised, but he was also touched. He was touched by her trust in him. He was touched by her unreserved trust in him. A gentleman would die for his bosom friend. Although he did not show anything on the surface, he had already made up his mind. Even if he had to risk his life, he would protect Ning Xuemo thoroughly. Originally, when he heard that Yang Ziyuan was going to get married in half a month, he was in despair and felt that there was nothing left to live for. His desire to live was not strong. If he did not have Ning Xuemo by his side, perhaps he would have turned back and directly fought Yi Qinghuan, but for the sake of Ning Xuemo, he had to persevere. Originally, he was exhausted to the extreme, but now his body seemed to have been injected with new vitality, lifting his spirits. According to Ning Xuemo's guidance, he took various forks in the road and set up various puzzles. In order to confuse Yi Qinghuan, at this moment, the two of them could only frequently backtrack and circle around various waterways. Since Ning Xuemo needed to change her bubble from time to time, the two of them would occasionally come across Bright Reverence cult's disciples. This was something that could not be helped. Once they met, Yi Feng would have to speed up when he entered the waterway again. Otherwise, Yi Qinghuan would quickly catch up. If Yi Qinghuan did not use various magic weapons, Ning Xuemo's method was indeed a good way to avoid being tracked. Even if Yi Qinghuan chased her for another 2 days, she might not be able to catch her. While the two of them were running, Ning Xuemo's heart suddenly skipped a beat. Kirin's voice suddenly sounded from the bottom of her heart. "Master, Master, where are you?" Ning Xuemo's eyes brightened. Little Apple. She had actually managed to contact Kirin again. Could it be that she had accidentally run into the vicinity of Carefree Island? Kirin nearly jumped up and clawed at the ancestor's hand. It happily shouted, "I can hear Master's voice. Ha ha ha, I've contacted Master." Chapter 673. The ancestor's foot slightly paused, and his fingers suddenly stiffened, causing the little Chelene to cry out in pain. "Hey, be gentle, you're hurting me." The sovereign's fingers loosened. He asked in a low voice, "What did she say?" Kirin was still excitedly chatting with Ning Xuemo. As it heard the sovereign's question, it subconsciously replied, "Master told me to hurry to Carefree Island and ask for reinforcements. She said that Yi Qinghuan had turned her into a cat and was being chased around like a rat. She told me to hurry and ask for reinforcements. This girl wasn't stupid. She knew that she couldn't deal with her. Who did she ask you to look for?" That girl should have remembered him by now, right? She should know that he was her only protective umbrella, right? She told me to look for Island Master Rongyue. She said that Island Master Rongyue might be able to stop Yi Qinghuan's crazy behavior. She said that Yi Qinghuan had entered a nearly insane state and that she couldn't afford to offend her. Kirin was almost repeating Ning Xuemo's words. The ancestor's footsteps paused again. His inky black eyes flashed with an icy cold light. In her time of crisis, the only person she thought of was an outsider like Rongyue Tianlan. She had thrown her cheap husband to the side. It seemed that she was truly ruthless towards him. That appearance of going back to the bridge and going back to the road wasn't an act, but a portrayal of her true state of mind. She really didn't care about him. She might even hate him. Then why was he still trying so hard to find her? A woman without a heart. Had he been too attentive to her? Kirine was desperately chatting with Ning Xuemore. It didn't notice that the sovereign's footsteps had slowed down. Sovereign, I asked her where she was. She said she was near Six Branches Mountain. How far is that from here? Will we be able to get there in time? 960 miles. The sovereign spat out a few words. He lightly said, tell her to hold on for 6 more hours. Rongyue Tianlan will rush over to save her. Ah. Kirine agreed. After it reacted, its eyes widened. Sovereign, you're not going to save her? You. Where are you going? It had already noticed that the ancestor had started to turn back. I'll send you back to Carefree Island to call for reinforcement. The sovereign finally decided on something and turned to leave. Kirine turned pale with fright. Ancestor, my master is very, very dangerous. You can't just stand by and watch us die. Before it could finish its words, the ancestor had already sealed its mute acupoint. It could only stare blankly, unable to speak. Leave him to die. He had lived for so many years. When had he ever saved someone who was about to die? Normally, he did not care about the affairs of the world. As Han Shanyu roamed the continent, it was inevitable that he would encounter some injustice and see some people being hunted down. Those people had desperately begged him for help. When had he ever reached out to help? Life and death were fated. He just had to ensure that the world situation did not deviate too much and that the demons did not run amok. The life and death of other people were nothing more than passing clouds to him. He didn't care about it at all. It was the first time in thousands of years that he had repeatedly broken his vows for a woman. He had already done all he could for this woman and had a clear conscience. Since she didn't care about him, then let her be. Moreover, she might not necessarily die. Although Yi Qingwan was extreme in her actions, she had a bottom line. She would not harm others' lives in vain. Besides, she was very fond of that cat, so she wouldn't really do anything to that girl. At most, she would be locked up for a while and let her suffer a little. Chapter 674. It was time for that girl to suffer. When the ancestor came here, he had used the instant 1,000-mile distance technique and the ground shrinking technique. It only took him a little more than 2 hours to travel more than 6,000 miles. Now, he was going back using the cloud traversing technique. Although he was still as fast as lightning, his speed was much slower than before. Kirine opened his eyes wide. He wanted to say something, but he couldn't. The moment Ning Xuemore contacted the little Cheline, she was extremely excited. She didn't know that the ancestor had brought the little Cheline to chase after her, and the little Cheline didn't have the time to tell her. She was a straightforward person and immediately reported her location. In fact, Han Shanyu had wronged her. It wasn't that she couldn't remember him at this time, but she thought that he was running away. She thought that only Rongyue Tianlan was with Kirine, so she immediately told Kirine to ask Rongyue Tianlan to come and save her. She didn't know that her inadvertent wrong order cut off the rescue team, and she had to pay the price. In fact, Kirine told her that Han Shanyu was coming to save her through telepathy. Ning Xuemore felt warm in her heart. She was about to ask Kirine where they were now and how long it would take for them to arrive, but her communication with Kirine was suddenly cut off again. She was shocked again and tried to contact him again, but there was no reply. She didn't know that Han Shanyu was very fast. Once he stepped on the return journey, he would be more than 1,000 miles away. Naturally, she couldn't contact Kirine. She was a little uneasy when she couldn't contact Kirine. However, since Great God Han had brought Kirine to find her and asked her to contact Kirine, he should be here soon, right? He should be less than 1,000 miles away from her. With his speed, he should be here in 2 hours at most. She just needed to hold on for 2 more hours. 2 more hours would be enough. It turned out that Great God Han didn't give up on her. He didn't leave her alone when he left without a word. Han Shanyue's face flashed in her mind, and a warm feeling emerged in her heart. He did care about her, didn't he? Ning Xuemore thought about what she did that day. She felt that she had gone overboard. She probably hurt Han Shanyu a little. No wonder he left in a rage. Fortunately, he didn't give up on her. Now, he brought Kirin to save her. He should care about her now. Otherwise, he wouldn't kiss her when she looked like an old lady. He was a clean freak. Usually, if someone touched him, he slapped them on the street. He should care about her, right? Kirin's heart, right? Humans were like that. Once they calmed down, they would be able to analyze the situation. She could consider things from the other's point of view. A lot of the Kirin the past was to Kirin. She was a secret agent, so she was very wary of people. Kirin. She couldn't fall asleep at all. That day, Han Shanyu slept with her on the same bed, but she didn't feel uncomfortable at all. She didn't even notice his existence at first. Chapter 675. This would have been impossible in the past. Usually, Ning Xuemore would have noticed it even if there was an extra button on her bed, not to mention having another person on it. However, she didn't feel anything when Han Shanyu was by her side. Of course, this was because the Almighty was regulating his breathing well, but it was also because she had subconsciously let down her guard against him. Perhaps she didn't realize it herself, but her body had already gotten used to his presence. She felt at ease when she was by his side. Ning Xuemore recalled the kiss and the words he said after the kiss. At that time, he had a faint smile on his lips and said that she liked him. He said it with such certainty that she had subconsciously denied it in her panic. People who worked as secret agents were all suspicious and wouldn't easily express their true feelings. Especially when it came to feelings, love would make people blind. Once they fell in love, they would easily lose their ability to judge. For a qualified secret agent, falling in love was a big taboo. As a secret agent, they could flirt with handsome guys, call them brothers, and even have one-night stands. They could play around in the world of mortals. However, they were afraid of stepping into the trap of love. This was also the main reason why Ning Xuemore had always misinterpreted Han Shanyue's feelings. Because subconsciously, she was repulsed and didn't dare to touch it. Moreover, Han Shanyu gave her the status of a concubine. If she didn't fall in love with him, she could ignore this status and even be his shield. However, once she fell in love, she would instinctively feel repulsed by this status. She would also feel that Han Shanyu didn't care about her at all. It was because of this mentality that she had repeatedly rejected Han Shanyue's love. She only used the status of a concubine to stab him and deal with him. Because of love, there was worry. Because of love, there was fear. It was because of love that she cared, felt conflicted, and subconsciously avoided it. Ning Xuemore had also sorted out her thoughts for the past 2 days. She analyzed what had happened and how she felt. After calming down, she finally understood one thing. She really did care about him, and she really did like him. She didn't even know when she had fallen for him. After figuring it out, Ning Xuemore once mocked herself in her heart. She thought she was smart, but she couldn't really understand her own feelings. She could see other people's moods and analyze other people's feelings, but when it came to herself, she couldn't see clearly. She even decided that once she returned to Carefree Island and returned to her own body, she would look for Han Shanyu and have a good chat with him. She would ask him just what he thought of her. Chapter 676. What was going on? Did something happen to them? It couldn't be, right? With Han Shanyue's abilities, who could make him get into an accident? But why wasn't he here yet? Why couldn't they contact Kirin? What in the world happened? Even though Ning Xuemore was smart, she didn't expect that Han Shanyu had already returned. She was still hoping that he would come. She was hoping that Han Shanyu, dressed in white, riding on the little Cheline, would suddenly descend like a divine soldier and save her from this calamity. Another hour passed by slowly. 3 hours, 3 hours. She was looking forward to every minute and every second. Every minute and every second, she was racking her brains to come up with all kinds of ways to escape. But this circle was getting smaller and narrower. There was no other reason. It was because when they were escaping, they suddenly found that there were more traps at the crossroads. These traps were colorless and transparent, the same color as water. Yi Feng was once again dizzy from running and bumped headfirst into a net of mechanisms. The trap was like a spider's web. Once it caught someone, it immediately started to close. If Ning Xuemore wasn't an expert in solving traps and quickly instructed Yi Feng to solve it, the two of them would have been captured. But even so, Yi Feng was injured by the trap and there were a few wounds on his body. After the two of them escaped, they were naturally more careful. Then, they found that there were more and more traps, and many of the crossroads were blocked by the traps. Because of the endless traps, Ning Xuemore and Han Shanyue's escape route became more and more difficult. Finally, after Ning Xuemore and Yi Feng desperately persevered for 4 hours, they finally met face to face with Yi Qinghuan in a waterway. Yi Feng was running very pathetically, and Yi Qinghuan, who was chasing after them, was also not much better than them. She was holding a dead fish in her hand, and her hair was dancing in the water like a yakshaw. Looking at Yi Feng and Ning Xuemore, her eyes flashed with madness. "Let's see where you can run to. You two brats, I will make you pay a price worse than death." Behind him was the network of mechanisms, and in front of him was the crazed Yi Qinghuan. Yi Feng and Yi Shiwen had escaped until now. They were truly at the end of their rope. "Miss Ning, I'm sorry. I've dragged you down." Yi Feng was distressed. He knew that there was no way out this time. It didn't matter if he died, but he implicated Ning Xuemore. Ning Xuemore also closed her eyes slightly. She had done her best. But Han Shanyu and Kirin never showed up. At this point, there was no doubt that Ning Xuemore and Yi Feng would be arrested. Sharkmen, who had already run out of strength, and a cat without any fighting power, how could they be a match for a master who was about to break through the heaven realm? Yi Feng was captured by Yi Qinghuan in less than 3 moves. The water bubble wrapped around Ning Xuemore fell to the ground. Yi Qinghuan looked down at Ning Xuemore. Her beautiful phoenix eyes were full of resentment and pride. "Little bitch, you will pay for what you did today." At this point, Ning Xuemore also threw caution to the wind. She was young and impetuous, and she knew that Yi Qinghuan would not let her go no matter what, so she might as well offend her to the end. "Old bitch. You are so perverted, so sinister, no wonder you were kicked out of the sect. No wonder the ancestor didn't want you." Although Ning Xuemore spoke in cat language, Yi Qinghuan had studied with the ancestor for a few years, so she understood the beast language. Chapter 677. Ning Xuemore's words directly stepped on Yi Qinghuan's sore spot. She was so angry that the fire in her heart soared 10 feet high. She waved her hand and broke the bubble that Ning Xuemore was relying on to survive. Ning Xuemore fell directly into the water. Yi Qinghuan coldly smiled. "Little slut, don't you like to run for your life in this water? Then stay here." She knocked out Yi Feng and then crossed her arms as she looked at Ning Xuemore. She wanted to drown her alive. This cat's body was unable to breathe in the water. Although she knew it was futile, Ning Xuemore was the type of person who wouldn't give up until she reached the Yellow River. Even if she reached the Yellow River, she wouldn't give up. Until the last moment of her life, she would never admit defeat. She would never accept her fate. Yi Qinghuan's lips curved up. She moved to the side, allowing Ning Xuemore to pass by her. This was an underground water vein. It was at least 7 or 8 miles away from the surface. With this cat's speed, it was impossible for her to swim 7 or 8 miles in a single breath. Doing so was futile. Yi Qinghuan's heart was filled with hatred. She wanted to see this little slut who had ruined everything for her desperately struggling in the water, and then despair. This process was hell for Ning Xuemore. But for Yi Qinghuan, it was a pleasant paradise. Han Shanyu didn't bring Kirin back to Carefree Island. Instead, he stopped at a place where Kirin could no longer contact Ning Xuemore. There was a small city nearby, and there was a tea house in the city. Han Shanyu carried Kirin and directly entered the tea house. Although he was dressed like an emperor, when he landed in the small city, he used a technique to hide his face. Outsiders would only see him as an ordinary young master. Moreover, he was a young master with a powerful aura. He asked for a private room. The waiter brought in some good tea and refreshments, but he waved his hand and shooed the waiter out. The little Cheline was casually thrown to the ground by him and had its acupoints sealed. It could only barely stand and couldn't run at all, let alone run off alone to save people. Karine was so angry that she almost vomited blood. She stood there clenching her teeth as she glared at Han Shan-yu. She wished she could pounce on this cold-blooded person and bite him. Cold-blooded animal. Cold-blooded bastard. Her master was fighting for her life, and he was in danger at every moment, and yet he was leisurely drinking tea here. Drink your fucking tea. The little Cheline couldn't wait to jump onto the table and piss into the teacup. Master, how is she now? She must be in her heart. She must be hoping that this man would save her. She didn't think that this man didn't care. He even didn't inform Tianlan. What was he planning? What was he planning? The little Cheline's mute acupoint was sealed and its body was weak. Although it was so anxious that it wanted to vomit blood, there was nothing it could do. It could only glare at Han Shan-yu, its eyes full of accusation. Han Shan-yu ignored her. He waved his sleeves and pushed aside the refreshments and tea that the waiter had brought in. He took out his tea set as if he was performing a magic trick. After a while, the faint fragrance of tea filled the tea house. Han Shan-yu picked up the cup and began to drink by himself. Time passed by slowly. While Karine was restless, while Han Shan-yu was leisurely drinking tea, 2 hours had passed. It was almost midnight, and the other guests in the tea house gradually dispersed. Han Shan-yu sat in the private room calmly. He didn't seem to have any intention of leaving. The managers and waiters of the tea house had been busy the whole day. They actually wanted to close the shop and go back to rest. Chapter 678. The shopkeepers and waiters wanted to hug their wives and children and enjoy life on a hot bed. But if this guest didn't leave, they couldn't close the door. The waiter came up to give him a hint. But this guest seemed to be in a daze and didn't respond to his hint. This guest's aura was too strong, so he didn't dare to chase him away. He could only ask the shopkeeper to come up. The shopkeeper braced himself and expressed that he wanted to close the door. The guest finally came back to his senses and glanced at him. This glance made the shopkeeper's heart go cold and he shivered. He didn't dare to say anything else. Fortunately, the guest was more understanding. He casually threw over 10 taels of gold as payment for the tea. Finally, the shopkeeper's eyes lit up and he tactfully shut his mouth. With the gold in his pocket, he respectfully said a few words of courtesy to the guest before he happily went back down. The town was very small, so the tea house was naturally very small. Usually, business was bleak. Even if they operated for a day, they might not be able to earn 2 taels of silver. But now, they had earned 10 taels of gold. In this era, 1 tael of gold could be exchanged for 50 taels of silver. 10 taels of gold was equivalent to 500 taels of silver. The shopkeeper was rich. He didn't want to close the door. It was worth it to accompany this guest for an entire night. Moreover, this guest wasn't a busybody. He didn't ask for refreshments, nor did he ask for more tea. He didn't even let anyone serve him. This gold was too worth it. The shopkeeper and the waiters left. The room returned to its original tranquility. Another hour passed. Karine couldn't bear it anymore. He pounced over and scratched the corner of Han Shan-yu's robe with his claws. Han Shan-yu seemed to be in a daze and didn't notice Karine's claws. The little Cheline was trying to kill him. In just a moment, it had already scratched a hole in the corner of his robe. Usually, when he touched him with his claws, he would kick him 3 feet away. What was wrong with him this time? Karine didn't understand and raised his head. He saw Han Shan-yu twirling a white glazed teacup in his hand and gazing out the window. He didn't know what he was thinking. Karine stared at the teacup in his hand and widened his eyes in shock. The white glazed teacups were the tea set that the tea house had just sent over. Even the tea inside was poured from an ordinary teapot next to it. The tea was no longer steaming, but the ancestor leaned closer to his lips and absent-mindedly took a sip. Han Shan-yu, who was so obsessed with cleanliness that it bordered on perverted, actually casually drank other people's tea. If it was any other time, Kareen would have cried out in surprise. But at this time, it was worried about its master and did not have the time to care about Han Shanue's abnormality. Just as it was about to pull at him a few more times, Han Shanyu suddenly looked down and brushed his sleeves. Kareen's throat felt warm, and he was able to speak again. Once he opened his mouth, he spat out a string of words. "You're a pervert. You watched as my master was in danger, yet you stood by and did nothing. You even said that you were her husband. Is this how you act as a husband? She has never treated me as her husband." Han Shanue's voice was cold. If he guessed correctly, Ning Xuemo was only using him as a shield that was dispensable. He had always been the one chasing after her, so this time, he wanted to teach her a lesson. Kareen's heart was still young and didn't understand the love between men and women. Of course, he didn't understand the psychology of sex. He only cared about the most important thing. "Didn't you say that you wanted to inform Island Master Rongyue? Then hurry up and inform her." Chapter 679. Why would he need someone else to save his own people? Han Shanyu was just waiting. Didn't that girl want Rongyue Tianlan to save her? With Rongyue Tianlan's speed, it would take her 6 hours to get here from Kareen after receiving Ning Xuemo's call for help. Therefore, Han Shanyu decided to wait 6 hours before going to save her. He would let her be frightened for 6 more hours to learn her lesson. He had been living a peaceful life all these years and had never felt that time was so difficult. He had been sitting in this tea house for almost 4 hours, and this was the first time he experienced what it felt like to live a day like a year. He had always been calm when doing things, but this time, he couldn't keep his cool. He seemed to be leisurely, but he was counting the hourglass in his heart. Kareen was angered by Han Shanue's last sentence. It had now regained its freedom and glared at him for a moment before scolding, "You cold-blooded pervert." With a leap, he jumped down from the window. Master was in danger and it wanted to save her. It wanted her not to be sad. Maybe it couldn't help her, but it wanted to be by her side when she was in danger. It wanted her to know that she was not alone. It had already remembered the location of Ning Xuemo, so after jumping out of the tea house, it ran in that direction. "Master, you have to hold on. Little Apple is coming." After running for less than 100 miles, it suddenly stopped and felt dizzy, falling to the ground with a plop. It was so uncomfortable. It was so uncomfortable. It felt like 10,000 bees had drilled into its head, and it was so painful that it felt like it was going to explode. There was a suffocating feeling in its chest and it felt like it couldn't breathe. It was the first time Kareen had experienced this feeling, and it was so uncomfortable that it rolled on the ground. "What's wrong?" Kareen's body became light and it fell into a person's palm. Kareen scratched its throat with its claws. Its originally blue face was purple and swollen, and its eyes were slightly bulging. It looked like it was holding its breath and choking on water. It forced out 2 words, "uncomfortable." It was so uncomfortable that its eyes were a little blurry. It could barely see who was holding it, only a blurry white shadow. Needless to say, this person was Di Zun and also Han Shanyu. He originally wanted to stay in the tea house for another 2 hours, but since Kareen couldn't take it and left, then he should leave too. Forget it. He would save her 2 hours earlier and it wouldn't be too late to settle the score after saving her. This was his plan, but he didn't expect that the little Cheline would suddenly roll on the ground as if it was suffering from epilepsy. Seeing Kareen's uncomfortable expression, his heart suddenly sank. Ning Xuemo. Ning Xuemo's soul was connected to Kareen's body. Once her soul was really injured, soul was to Dai's body. It's to Dai's / if half of the pain was enough to make the little Cheline wish he was dead, then what kind of torment was Ning Xuemo, the main body? Did Yi Qingwan really hurt her? Di Zun didn't care about anything else. He picked up Kareen, and once again used the 1,000 miles in a flash, and the earth shrinking technique, to rush in the direction of Ning Xuemo. His palms continued to transfer psychokinesis into Kareen's body. Finally, Kareen recovered. Sense where she is. He had to find her as soon as possible. They couldn't afford to waste even a single second. Chapter 680. Karine didn't have time to scold him at this time. She forced herself to use her spirit to sense for a while. Suddenly, she cried out, "I can sense her, but she doesn't reply to me. She just feels very uncomfortable. She feels very uncomfortable. She is going to die. Her soul is going to scatter. She must have fallen into the hands of that evil woman. She destroyed some of that woman's precious things. That woman hates her so much that she must want to scatter her soul. She destroyed Yi Qingwan's things? She didn't just save Yi Feng and escape." The ancestor's voice was heavy. That's right, that's right. She hated Yi Qingwan for turning her into a cat without any explanation. In order to take revenge on Yi Qingwan, she destroyed Yi Qingwan's most important thing, burned down Yi Qingwan's house, and killed Yi Qingwan's disciple. The little Chelin told Ning Shuamore everything that happened during their conversation. "Bastard. Why didn't you say so earlier? You sealed my mute acupoint. You didn't let me say it at all. I even told my master that you were coming and that you would save her immediately. I told her not to be afraid. She said that she would try her best to delay until you came. She also asked me to urge you to hurry up. She couldn't hold on any longer. She said that she had something to say to you." Karine shouted as if she had broken down. Han Shanyu staggered slightly. He didn't say anything, but he increased his speed to the maximum. After Ning Shuamore came to this world, she had been drowned twice. Both times, the feeling was very uncomfortable. It left a deep impression on her. However, compared to this time, the 2 times she was drowned were nothing. When she was drowned to the extreme, one time she fainted, and the other time she opened the mouth of the sky. Whether it was fainting or opening the mouth of the sky, both were resolved. It was the body that was drowned, not the soul. At that time, she didn't feel that her soul was injured. But this time, she was obviously drowned to the extreme. She was obviously in so much pain that she wanted to scratch her ears and cheeks, but she didn't faint. Yi Qingwan didn't lie to her. She put some kind of curse on the cat's body. The cat's body was drowned, and her soul couldn't get out. She could only taste the feeling of being drowned again and again in the cat's body. She was so uncomfortable that her entire soul curled up. Her head was in a daze. How unbearable. It was so uncomfortable. He really wanted to faint. If only he could faint. Even if he had to die, she could feel her soul splitting apart bit by bit, as if water had also entered her body. Her 3 souls and 6 spirits were about to explode. She didn't know how much time had passed, but just when she felt that her soul couldn't hold on any longer and was about to disperse, her eyes lit up slightly. Her cat body was finally lifted out of the water, dripping wet. Someone patted it on the back, and Yi Qingwan whispered in its ear, "Don't drown my good little white." The cat was taken out of the water. Ning Shuamore's dizzy mind cleared up for a moment. She forced herself to open her eyes and saw Yi Qingwan's beautiful eyes. Yi Qingwan was in a good mood as she finally caught up with the person she wanted to cook. She tidied herself up again and her hair was neatly combed. She looked elegant and picturesque. Seeing Ning Shuamore open her eyes, she smiled. Her smile was quite gentle. "Little girl, you have to hold on a little longer." She wanted to play with her properly. Ning Shuamore closed her eyes again. Her soul was a little injured, and her mind wasn't really clear. Only a vague thought flashed through her mind. This time, she was really done for. She had held on for more than 4 hours, but there was still no help. Chapter 681. Sure enough, it was better to rely on oneself than on others. It was better to rely on oneself than on others, because Yi Feng and the others had been running in circles to avoid Yi Qingwan's pursuit. The place where they were caught was not far from the Bright Reverence cult's headquarters. Yi Qingwan rode on the Qingwan heavenly bird, carried the dying cat, and carried Yi Feng. In less than an hour, they returned to her old territory. Of course, she did not let Ning Shuamore have an easy time along the way. As long as she saw that she was slightly awake, she would torture her. Her technique was indeed powerful. She could torture Ning Shuamore's soul without hurting the white cat's body. Before the discomfort of being drowned by the water disappeared, She began to taste the feeling of being blown apart by the hurricane. Every time her soul could not hold on and was about to fall apart, Yi Qinghuan would try to gather her soul back together. After stabilizing a little, she would continue to torture her. Ning Xuemo finally knew that death was such a difficult thing. She finally knew that there was such a punishment in this world. Little girl, it seems that you don't know the immensity of heaven and earth. I will teach you a lesson. When Ning Xuemo was half unconscious, she heard Yi Qinghuan's words. The voice was as cold and noble as usual, but the words were bloodthirsty and cruel. Ning Xuemo was in a trance, but she did not lower herself and replied, "Old woman, I will wait and see." As soon as it finished speaking, it was picked up by the cold wind and continued to taste the pain of being torn apart by the hurricane. When Ning Xuemo was slightly awake again, she opened her eyes and found that she was in a large hall. She slowly turned her eyes and recognized that this hall was one of Yi Qinghuan's side halls. There were not many things in the side hall, but each of them looked very strange. There was a red and black whip, a light green nailboard, and even a guillotine. The most conspicuous thing was the big cauldron in the middle of the hall. There was a light green flame burning under the cauldron, and boiling oil was rolling in the cauldron. This place was like a torture chamber. The only difference between this place and the torture chambers in other places was that the torture instruments in other places were real, but the torture instruments in this place seemed to be illusory. They were all shrouded in a layer of light green, like silhouettes. "Little girl, you've got guts. How dare you provoke me? I've been too nice to you. I didn't let you taste these punishments, and you're already so lawless." Yi Qinghuan lifted Ning Xuemo up, looked into its eyes, and smiled gently. "Tell me, which one should I let you taste first? Have you heard of the 18 levels of hell? Climb a mountain of blades, dive into a pot of boiling oil, and be sliced in half with a knife. Or do you want to have a taste of the whip first?" After going through a round of flooding and several rounds of heavenly winds, her head was already dizzy. She couldn't even hear Yi Qinghuan's words clearly. He could only faintly hear something about the 18 levels of hell. She stared blankly at the whip, unable to react for a moment. Did this bastard woman want to whip her? Ha, wasn't she afraid that her precious cat would be whipped to death? She smiled absent-mindedly. When she was really desperate, she would not give in. "Bitch who no one wants, just bring it on. Look, I'm not afraid of you, bastard." Yi Qinghuan's face changed. This bitch who no one wanted had provoked her. She threw Ning Xuemo to the ground, opened her hand, and the red and black whip fell into her hand. She whipped Ning Xuemo. Chapter 682. The red and black shadow of the whip swept across the white cat's body. There were no wounds on the white cat's body, but it rolled over with a low cry. Ning Xuemo finally understood what was going on. It turned out that this damned woman's torture tools were specifically targeted at souls. What she had hit was a soul and not the white cat. Her soul was in so much pain that it almost split open. Ning Xuemo trembled slightly on the ground, but she laughed loudly. "Old woman, you're angry out of shame. Ha ha ha." Yi Qinghuan was speechless. Usually, when she whipped the cat, even the most cunning soul would bow down and beg for mercy. She didn't expect that Ning Xuemo, who she thought was the most obedient, would be so infuriating once she got tough. "Let's see if you can still be so stubborn." Yi Qinghuan was so angry that she whipped the cat again and again. The white cat kept rolling on the ground. It hurt. It hurt as if it was being torn apart. Ning Xuemo felt like she was going to be whipped into pieces. Her soul couldn't hold on anymore and slowly cracked open. Was she going to die completely? This vague thought flashed through her mind. Ever since she came to this world, she had been trying her best to live. No matter what happened, she never gave up on the chance to live. She wanted to live on. But now, she longed to die. She longed to have her soul scattered and become unconscious. She had been relying on her unyielding spirit to support herself, but now her spirit was also collapsing. Once her vitality was released, the originally well-combined soul could no longer be held together and began to drift away piece by piece. "You can't take it anymore? You want to give up? I haven't had enough fun yet." Yi Qinghuan waved her sleeve and a faint green light enveloped the white cat. The slowly escaping soul was once again forcefully gathered together. Ning Xuemore felt like her body was being forcefully twisted and then curled up. Her hands and feet were no longer in their original positions, and all the joints were dislocated. Where the hands should be, there were legs installed, and where the neck should be, there was a head forcibly installed. It was an indescribable feeling of terror and pain. In the end, she was still a girl. She had never suffered such pain in her life. In her days, she instinctively screamed. Since she was in the cat's body, her voice was naturally a mournful cat's meow. Her voice was so pitiful that it was frightening to hear. Yi Qinghuan finally smiled with satisfaction. She picked her up and walked to the big cauldron. You will look better if you are fried in the oil. Don't worry, the oil inside is from the underworld. It will only fry your soul. It won't hurt my precious cat. Throwing a soul into a pot of boiling oil was the worst punishment for a soul. She believed that after this audacious little girl was fried in a pot of oil, her soul would fly away and be annihilated. He had chased her for half a day and was exhausted. He had to ask his disciples to find a fresh soul to replace Ning Xuemore and live in the cat's body. Then she could go and rest after dealing with Ning Xuemore. Her painstaking collection over the years flashed in front of her eyes. She clenched her fists with hatred. She was about to throw Ning Xuemore into the oil cauldron when the door was pushed open with a bang. A disciple rushed in and said, "Master, Di Zun. Di Zun is here. WH. What?" Yi Qinghuan's heart felt like it was hit by a big hammer. The white cat in her hand fell to the ground. Her master was here. Her master was here. How? How could it be? Chapter 683. All these years, Yi Qinghuan had been scheming to see Di Zun again, but she couldn't. He had always avoided her. He also didn't allow her to approach the Sun-Moon sect. Now he was here. Did he finally remember her? Yi Qinghuan's hands and feet trembled, and her mind went blank. She subconsciously said, Quick, invite him. No, order all the disciples to go out and welcome him." She subconsciously pulled her clothes, tidied her hair, and was about to run out. Bang! With a loud sound, the half-closed door suddenly broke into pieces and flew out. Yi Qinghuan was so shocked that she trembled. She hurriedly raised her head, and then stood there as if struck by lightning. A figure in white appeared at the door of the hall. His white robe was like winding clouds, and his hair was like the purest ink. The mask on his face covered his entire face, and only a pair of ink-black eyes were like cold whirlpools. After not seeing him for so many years, he still looked the same as before. It was the face she yearned for day and night. Master. Yi Qinghuan didn't expect to see him again. She staggered 2 steps forward and crawled at his feet just like before. She thought that Di Zun would wave his sleeves and ask her to stand up after she finished the greeting as a disciple, just like before. She didn't expect that he would wave his sleeves, but he didn't ask her to stand up. Yi Qinghuan hadn't even touched the corner of Di Zun's clothes when her body suddenly swayed and was thrown out like a broken bag. With a bang, she hit the pillar. Yi Qinghuan was hit so hard that she saw stars flying in front of her eyes. Her heart was so shocked that it almost split open. "Master," she called out in a trembling voice. Her hair was messed up, and her clothes were messy. She got up dizzily and couldn't help but look at Di Zun. Then, she was stunned. Di Zun actually picked up the cat. His fingers gently stroked the cat's head, and his fingertips trembled slightly. He was too late. Ning Xuemore had already been tortured, and her soul was trembling violently in the cat's body. He picked her up, but she didn't seem to feel anything. Master, do you still remember Xiaobai? It's the cat that Master asked Disciple to adopt back then. Disciple has always kept it alive and well, just so that Master can see it again one day." Yi Qinghuan knelt down at the side again, her lips trembling with excitement. "Shut up." The ancestor finally opened his mouth. His voice was as cold as the wind of the 12th lunar month. His gaze finally fell on her. "Yi Qinghuan, I am no longer your master." Yi Qinghuan's body trembled. Her lips squirmed, but she did not dare to say anything else. "Master." Kareen rushed into the hall and ran straight to the ancestor's feet. He looked at the white cat in the ancestor's arms. Master! Master! Yi Qinghuan's eyes widened. Qilin beast! This Kareen must be summoning that bitch. On this continent, there was only one person who had subdued a Qilin beast, that trash, Ning Xuemo. She was well informed. In fact, she had long heard of Ning Xuemo's reputation, but she didn't take this little girl seriously. After hearing about Ning Xuemo, she was not interested in this person. Instead, she was very interested in Kareen, who was by her side. However, she had not found the time to visit her yet. Who would have thought? The soul that she had accidentally captured was actually that useless girl. That ancestor. Ancestor came for her. No, it couldn't be, right? How could that bitch be favored by Ancestor? Or maybe Ancestor also took a fancy to the Qilin beast, so he paid a little attention to that girl? In that instant, many questions flashed through her mind. Chapter 684. Yi Qinghuan's greedy eyes fell on the Di Zun again. She wanted to devour every inch of him. She missed him deeply. When she saw him again, she wanted to engrave his figure in her heart. She saw Kareen desperately pulling at the Di Zun's robe with its 2 claws and couldn't help but be furious. The Di Zun wouldn't allow anyone or any beast to approach and violate him. This little Qilin actually dared to scratch an emperor without knowing the immensity of heaven and earth. How dare you, Kareen beast! Yi Qinghuan shouted angrily. She was about to cast a spell to push Kareen away. But when she saw the Di Zun's next move, she stopped. The Di Zun's fingers gently wrapped around the cat's head, and a faint white light completely enveloped it. The spell that Yi Qinghuan cast on the white cat was easily dissolved by him, and Ning Xuemo's soul was taken out by him. Ning Xuemo's soul had been twisted into a ball and was trembling in his palm. She was in a semi-conscious state and didn't know that she had fallen into the Di Zun's hands. The only thing she felt now was pain. It was so painful that she wanted to disperse and turn into ashes. That was because she had wanted to give up, and she had suffered so much. Her soul was already severely injured, and the moment she mentioned it, her 3 souls and 6 spirits showed signs of dissipating. Xuemo. The Di Zun's voice was tight. He waved his fingers and waves of green light completely enveloped her soul. He nourished her with his psychic power. Xuemo, don't give up. Master. Kareen usually couldn't see Ning Xuemo's soul. It could only see it when it turned on its tearful mode. Kareen didn't cry easily, but it had just experienced almost the same pain as Ning Xuemo. It was in so much pain that it had tears in its eyes. So it could see Ning Xuemo's soul clearly now. At this moment, when it saw that she was almost deformed, it cried out, Master! Master! Yi Qinghuan looked at this scene blankly, and her heart sank. She had never seen the Di Zun treat someone so gently. Her whole body was cold, and her eyes flashed with hatred as she looked at Ning Xuemo's soul. Jealousy burned like a raging fire in her chest. If she had known earlier, she would have destroyed this living soul the moment she caught it. Her master was hers. There should only be one woman by her master's side. The ancestor was standing right there. She was so close to him, but she didn't dare to take a step forward. She didn't dare to touch the corner of his clothes. No matter how hard she tried, she still couldn't get close to the ancestor. However, the soul of Ning Xuemo, an ordinary person, was placed in the palm of his hand and protected. She hated Ning Xuemo so much that she clenched her teeth, but she didn't dare to show it on her face. She said in a low voice, Disciple. Disciple didn't know that Master cared about her. Before she could finish her explanation, a long black and red shadow flashed past her eyes. With a smack, it brushed past her mouth. Ah! Yi Qinghuan was caught off guard. She screamed and fell to the ground. I'll say it again, I'm not your master. Yi Qinghuan, how many times have you whipped her? The ancestor's voice was like a storm. His hand was holding the punishment whip that specialized in beating souls. Yi Qinghuan didn't know how many people she had whipped with this whip, but she never thought that one day this whip would fall on her body. The ancestor's lightning whip almost split her soul in half. She was in so much pain that she rolled on the ground, unable to say a word. The ancestor's eyes fell on Ning Xuemo's soul. There were several whip marks on it, and each of them hurt her soul root. Chapter 685. The ancestor coldly said, "Yi Qingwan, since you whipped her 10 times, I will make you pay back double." Seeing Ning Xuemo's soul seriously injured, he was furious to the extreme. After he finished speaking, he waved his hand. That black and red whip immediately flew up by itself and lashed towards Yi Qingwan, who was on the ground. The whip's shadow moved horizontally and vertically, tearing the air with a whistling sound. Yi Qingwan was scared out of her wits. She wanted to dodge but didn't dare to. Moreover, with her strength, she couldn't dodge. The whip's shadow fell on her body like a viper. The whip fell, accompanied by a scream, and she rolled on the ground. When she used this whip to whip others, she was afraid that it wasn't painful enough, that it wasn't ruthless enough. Now that the whip had landed on her body, she realized that it was actually this painful. Every whip almost pierced into her bone marrow and spread from the depths of her bone marrow to her limbs and bones. She had originally wanted to be strong in front of the Di Zun, so she didn't struggle or shout, but when the whip landed on her body, the pain spread throughout her body like lightning, and she couldn't help but scream. She couldn't help but tremble and roll. Her scream was so shrill that it almost penetrated the roof tiles. In fact, many Bright Reverence Religion disciples had gathered outside the main hall. After all, the arrival of the ancestor was no different from spring thunder to the disciples of Bright Reverence Religion. Everyone's spirit was lifted. After all the disciples here knew that their leader was once the ancestor's disciple. The disciples of Bright Reverence Religion basically relied on this name to travel outside. A large part of the reason why many people joined Bright Reverence Religion was because of this relationship. The Sun Moon sect's disciple selection was very strict. With their aptitude, they couldn't enter. Therefore, they chose to join Bright Reverence Religion. This made them feel as if they were also disciples of the Sun Moon sect, just a side branch. Because of this relationship, the number of disciples joining Bright Reverence Religion was more than other sects. This was also the reason why Bright Reverence Religion was able to grow so strong over the years. These disciples naturally longed for the ancestor and revered him as if he was a god. However, after joining Bright Reverence Religion for so many years, they hadn't seen the ancestor even once. Now, they heard that the ancestor had personally come. This news spread like lightning in Bright Reverence Religion. Many disciples heard the news and came. They all gathered outside the main hall, waiting for the ancestor to come out and greet him. Naturally, after they arrived, they heard some disciples whispering that the venerable ancestor didn't seem to have good intentions. He suddenly appeared. Her disciples also criticized her a lot, but they did not dare to show it. Now that she was screaming miserably in the main hall, the disciples looked at each other in dismay. Not to mention rushing in to save people, no one even rushed in to take a look. Hearing Yi Qingwan's tragic cry, they quietly took a few steps back. Some of the intelligent monsters had already begun to ponder over the idea of leaving Bright Reverence Religion. Naturally, the people in the hall would not know about the undercurrent outside. The 20 lashes were quickly finished. Even with Yi Qingwan's cultivation, half of her life was gone. She lay on the ground, twitching non-stop. The whip didn't hit her body, so other than rolling around messily, there wasn't a single wound on her body. However, there were spirit medicines that could heal physical injuries, and they would recover quickly. This soul was injured, but it could not be healed. She would not be able to recover from this whipping even after a few decades. Chapter 687. Yi Qingwan's voice had already become hoarse from all the shouting. At this moment, she was lying on the ground, gasping for breath. The hall was so quiet that only the sound of her heavy breathing could be heard. As for the ancestor, after he finished the 20 lashes, he casually threw the whip away. It fell in front of Yi Qingwan, causing her to tremble in fear. She could feel that the ancestor was coldly looking at her. His body was filled with murderous intent. That powerful murderous intent made Kirine, who was beside him, shudder. She did not dare to cry again. Yi Qingwan naturally also felt that kind of aura. She had stayed by his side for 3 years, but she had never seen him so angry. This made her inexplicably think of a rumor: the ancestor was not easily angry. Once he was angry, he would be like thunder. It was possible that blood would flow like a river. She panicked. Ancestor, ancestor. Blood flowed from the corner of her mouth. She did not dare to call him master again. Ignoring the tearing pain all over her body, her eyes widened. Trembling, she reached out her hand to the ancestor. This disciple did not do it on purpose. This disciple did not know her identity. She destroyed this disciple's things and killed 17 bright reverence disciples. This disciple punished her. Ancestor, ancestor, this disciple knows her mistake. Her voice was mournful as she lay on the ground. Ancestor, Qingwan was once your disciple. The ancestor faintly frowned and quietly took a step back. Because this disciple had feelings for him, she was unceremoniously expelled from the sect. But after all, he had personally taught her martial arts for several years. If he said that he did not have any feelings for her, it would be a lie. He still had a little bit of master-disciple relationship with her. The moment he saw that Ning Xuemore was seriously injured, his first thought was to kill the culprit, Yi Qingwan, and scatter her soul. But now, seeing her like this, you ignored Xuemore's wishes and turned her into a cat. Now you blame her for destroying your things? The ancestor coldly said. He glanced at the cat's body on the ground and frowned in disgust. With his cultivation, he could naturally see that this cat was a rather ordinary domestic cat. Moreover, it had a kind of evil aura. This cat should have died long ago. It was just that someone had used the soul energy of a living soul to support this cat's body so that it wouldn't rot or break. In fact, Di Zun had long heard that Yi Qingwan loved a cat very much. He thought that she was raising a little cat demon and didn't care about her, so he didn't pay attention to this cat at all. It was only because he had just pulled Ning Xuemore's soul out of the cat's body that he paid extra attention to it. Seeming to have noticed the ancestor's gaze, Yi Qingwan crawled over with difficulty and held the cat in her arms. She looked at the ancestor with fanaticism and expectation in her eyes. Mars. Ancestor, do you still remember this cat? It was rescued by the venerable sovereign in the dark forest when he brought his disciples out for training. Master. Venerable sovereign, you even teased it. The ancestor faintly frowned. In order to train his disciples, he would usually take them to the dark forest to gain experience. Firstly, he wanted to see their aptitude, and secondly, he wanted to see their courage. His memory could be considered extremely strong, and he vaguely remembered that there was indeed such a thing. At that time, he threw Yi Qingwan into the dark forest and stayed there for 3 days. 3 days later, he went to see her and found that there was an extra cat by her side. It seemed to be this white cat. There were many demonic beasts in the dark forest, but it was rare to see a pure domestic cat like this white cat. This domestic cat probably accompanied Yi Qingwan for 3 days and she liked it very much. She whispered to the ancestor to let her take this cat in. Chapter 688. At that time, although the ancestor felt that his disciple raising a cat was a little too frivolous, considering that she was a girl and the cat was indeed well behaved, he agreed. He also threw the wild rabbit leg that Yi Qingwan gave him as a filial piety to the cat. Of course, the ancestor didn't take this little episode to heart. If it weren't for his super powerful memory, even if Yi Qingwan mentioned it, he might not have remembered it. It was just an ordinary and good-looking house cat. The lifespan of a cat was only about 10 years. How did she make it live for hundreds of years? He remembered the spirit trapping technique that was used on the cat. It seemed that Ning Xuemore wasn't the first victim. There should be other living souls for her to use. This spirit trapping technique was a forbidden technique. Although he also knew it, he had never used it nor taught it to his disciple. Where did Yi Qinghuan learn it? How many innocent creatures had she harmed? The ancestor thought of the rumors about Yi Qinghuan in Jianghu. His eyes darkened and he casually swept his gaze around the hall. His gaze fell on the big cauldron. The boiling oil in the cauldron was still boiling, bringing with it a burning heat. Soul refining cauldron. It was a magic tool used to refine souls. Only the prison wardens of the underworld could have it. It was used to deal with those evil spirits who had done all kinds of evil in their lives. His gaze fell on the sharp dingban and the bright guillotine, and his pupils constricted slightly. These two things were also owned by the prison wardens of the 18th layer of hell. The nail was used to nail people's souls. Each nail was enough to nail a restrained soul. As for the guillotine, it would let the tortured soul taste the torture of being cut in half at the waist from time to time. The pain would tear the soul apart and slowly disperse the soul. Each of the things here was used to refine souls. They should be used to deal with those evil spirits who had committed heinous crimes, didn't repent, and couldn't be redeemed even if they died 100 times. Even the king of hell would be frightened if he saw these things. But now, they had appeared here so openly. They appeared in the main hall of the Bright Reverence School, which considered itself an orthodox school. Each of these things was a rare magic tool. It was impossible to collect them in a short time. Furthermore, Yi Qinghuan didn't send them here just to deal with Ning Xuemor. They had been here for a long time. Yi Qinghuan was his former female disciple, a disciple who practiced orthodox Daoist techniques, a disciple who once said in front of him that it was her duty to rid the world of evil and bring peace to the people. But now, such an evil thing had appeared in her palace. Di Zun's eyes finally fell on Yi Qinghuan again. His eyes were cold, without any warmth, as if it was the first time he had seen her. Yi Qinghuan's heart tightened under his gaze and her body shrank back. At the same time, her mind, which had been in chaos since the appearance of the venerable sovereign, finally cleared up. Her gaze swept over the magic tools in her hall, and her face instantly turned pale. She struggled on the ground and subconsciously wanted to put away those things, but how could she do it? Yi Qinghuan, I was wrong about you in the end. The ancestor spoke slowly, a cold glint flashing in his extremely black eyes. He thought that because she had some thoughts that she shouldn't have, her temper was a bit stubborn and her actions were a bit paranoid. Yi Qinghuan didn't like to explain, so it was inevitable that people would misunderstand her. There were also many people who criticized her secretly. Her actions shouldn't be too excessive. But he didn't expect. Chapter 689. It turned out that Yi Qinghuan was already so extreme. What was the difference between her and the witch? If she was really the witch of the devil world, it would be fine, but she was also wearing the cloak of an orthodox sect. Wherever she went, she liked to use the ancestor's banner. He was partial to his disciple, but it didn't mean that he had no bottom line. The cold aura on his body was too strong, and his powerful pressure filled the entire hall, making everything in the hall seem like it was going to be covered with a layer of frost. Karine saw him like this for the first time. He was so scared that he quietly stepped back and shook the scales on his body. As a bystander, Karine was already like this, let alone Yi Qinghuan who was facing his pressure. Master! Yi Qinghuan's heart almost jumped out, and she called out to him in a panic. Just as she called out, a gust of cold wind flashed past her lips, and her face seemed to be whipped. She screamed and several of her teeth were whipped out. I don't have a disciple like you, the ancestor said coldly, and there was no warmth in his voice. Yi Qinghuan, you are so insidious, how can you be worthy of the martial arts I taught you? He stretched out his left hand, and a snow-white long sword appeared in his palm. This long sword seemed to be made of ice and snow, and the cold edge of the sword revealed a dense chill. As soon as Yi Qinghuan saw the sword, she knew that something bad had happened. She was almost scared out of her wits. Mars. Ancestor, disciple. No, this lowly one won't dare to do it again. Ancestor, Please don't." She didn't even have time to beg for mercy when a snow-white light flashed in front of her eyes and fell on several of her vital acupoint. Yi Qinghuan's body suddenly became cold, as if her whole body was poured by ice and snow. All of her veins were frozen inch by inch, and when the ice and snow melted, the psychokinesis flowing in her veins quietly disappeared. Her face was pale, and she was lying on the ground, unable to get up. Despair engulfed her. Her martial arts were completely destroyed. From now on, she was a complete waste. She couldn't cultivate anymore. Yi Qingluan, from today onwards, this lord will order people to thoroughly investigate your and Bright Reverence cult's actions in these past years. You must give an explanation to the people of the world. The ancestor spat out these words. Then, he walked out of the hall without looking back. Yi Qingluan's face became even paler. When the ancestor wanted to thoroughly investigate something, there was nothing he couldn't find out. Then all the dirty things she had done all these years, with the venerable emperor's thunderous methods of handling matters, she was afraid that it would not be as simple as having her martial arts cripple. She desperately threw herself forward and looked at the ancestor's back as she wailed, "Ancestor! Ancestor, for the sake of our friendship from 2,000 years ago, isn't it a bit too heartless for you to treat me like this?" The ancestor's silhouette paused for a moment before he strode away. Yi Qinghuan slumped down at the entrance of the hall. The pain in her body penetrated her bones, and her heart was as cold as ice. She lay on the ground and was silent for a moment. Suddenly, he raised his head and laughed wildly. Her laughter was maniacal and shrill, completely different from her usual image. She laughed heartily and tears came out of her eyes. Ruthless. The ancestor's heart was truly ruthless. Everything that she had worked so hard for had been destroyed overnight. She had been wailing in the main hall for so long, and the ancestor had already left, but not a single disciple had come in to see her. Needless to say, her disciples either didn't react in time or realized that the myth had been broken, so they probably thought of another way out. In his eyes, this little girl had always been tenacious and unyielding. No matter what kind of danger she encountered, she would always seek every opportunity to survive. She was weak and could even be considered a piece of trash, but her life was more exciting and resplendent than anyone else. This was the first time he had seen her like this. She wanted to die so badly. For the first time in his life, he felt a strong sense of regret. If he had not wasted those 4 hours, she would not have ended up like this. During those 4 hours, she must have been looking forward to his arrival like she was looking forward to the moon and the stars, right? And he had let her down in the end. He didn't know if Ning Xuemore would have resented him the moment she was captured. After all, she was very smart. She could have calculated the time when the reinforcements would arrive based on the time when Kareen contacted her and his usual walking speed. Chapter 691. It was less than 1,000 miles. With Han Shanue's usual speed, it would only take him a little more than 2 hours. Adding the time spent searching, it would not exceed 4 hours. If he had arrived in time, she would not have fallen into Yi Qinghuan's hands and would not have suffered so much. "Xuemore, I'm sorry." His fingers gently touched the ball of green light, and his heart tightened. Inside the green light, Ning Xuemore was like a bird startled by the twang of a bow. Just as his finger touched it, the soul trembled slightly and shrunk back into a corner. She seemed to be afraid of him, or it could be said that her soul was now afraid of any kind of touch. Although Ning Xuemore's soul was moving, her mind was not clear. She could only rely on her instincts to cry out in pain and avoid any possible harm. No matter if the touch was to harm her or to save her, she would avoid it, and shrink there like a ball. Judging from her appearance, she shouldn't have just been injured by the whip. Her soul was distorted, which was the main reason why she was in so much pain and lost consciousness. But he could not forcibly change her soul at this time. She was now like a porcelain with cracks all over her body. If he moved a little more, she might immediately break into countless pieces and never be able to be assembled again. The ancestor could not do anything to her now. At most, he could use the green light to nourish her soul and make it slightly stronger. A soul that wanted to persevere needed the support of a strong spiritual power and the belief to live. But now, Ning Xuemore did not know whether it was because the pain was too severe or because she was in real despair. She did not have the slightest thought of living, and only hoped for death. Xuemore, bear with it. I will heal you. I will not let you suffer anymore. Regardless of whether she could hear him or not, he transmitted his voice to her. Xuemore, it's okay, it's okay. You are not in danger. No one will hurt you again. The ancestor transmitted his voice to comfort her again and again. Perhaps his voice transmission really worked, as the trembling soul in the green barrier finally calmed down. Di Zun took the opportunity to send some telekinesis into the barrier to strengthen her soul power. Slowly, she seemed to sense something, and her mind became slightly clearer. She floated closer to him, and the ancestor heard her hoarse whisper, Han. Han Shan Yu. The prolonged pain had caused her voice to change pitch. It was trembling slightly, like a small beast that was on the verge of death. It's me. The ancestor softly spat out these two words, his eyes twinkling slightly as he looked at her. You're late. Her voice sounded as if she had been wronged. She vaguely remembered those 2 hours of fervent hope, from hope to despair. I'm sorry. In the future, I won't. The ancestor could only say this, his voice filled with regret. In the future, I will rely on myself. Her mind was half awake and half confused, and her mind was in a mess. She subconsciously said what she thought, I can't rely on anyone. In the future, I will rely on myself. This was the only thought that came to her mind when she was captured. It was a very simple sentence, but the ancestor's heart felt as if it had been stabbed by a knife. He could not say anything. Perhaps because her thoughts were too intense, a few more cracks appeared on her soul, and the pain came again. She trembled and curled into a ball. Let me die. Han Shan Yu, you are a bad person. Chapter 692. I beg you, let me die. It hurts. Woo woo. Just kill me. She wanted to roll around in the green light again. Ning Xuemore, you have to hold on. Seeing that Xuemore's soul was about to dissipate, the ancestor shouted, I won't let you die. You have to hold on. But it hurts. It hurts. She was crying. At this time, she had removed all her disguises and was like an ordinary girl who cried when she was in great pain. Her cries weren't loud, but it made his heart clench. Before meeting Ning Xuemore, he had never felt this way. This feeling was very novel to the ancestor, and it made him feel quite helpless. He could only comfort her again and again. Be good, don't cry. I will cure you. Don't cry. He had never coaxed anyone in his life. After transmitting his voice, he was also shocked by his own gentle tone. But when he heard her crying, he couldn't help but comfort her. His voice also lowered a few pitches. Kireen naturally couldn't hear their transmission, but it could hear Ning Xuemore crying. It was the first time it had heard its master cry like this. She was crying like a child. It also couldn't help but want to cry. It had established a blood contract with Ning Xuemore, but this blood contract was different from the heart-linking venomous insects. The little Cheline would only be able to empathize with her when she was in the middle of receiving an injury, or when it was an injury to her soul. Of course, this kind of feeling was not one-to-one. If Ning Xuemore's pain level was 10, Kireen's pain level was about 6. Once the damage to her soul was removed, no matter how much pain Ning Xuemore was in, Kireen wouldn't feel it. Of course, if her soul really dissipated, Kireen would also die. At this time, Kireen heard Ning Xuemore murmuring that she was going to die. It felt sad and tears flowed out. She immediately used telepathy to send a message. Master, I'm Little Apple. You can hear me, right? You can't die. Little Apple won't let you die. What will happen to Little Apple if you die? Woo woo woo. The more it thought about it, the sadder it became, and its tears flowed even harder. The little Cheline was crying behind them like a tearful Cheline. It was a water beast to begin with. When it cried, its tears flowed freely, forming a small stream on its face. It was a standard tearful scene. Occasionally, the ancestor would lower his head to look at it. When he saw it crying like this, the blue veins on his forehead throbbed. He had raised many mythological beasts before, but Kirene was definitely the only mythological beast that was so sentimental. If the other mythological beasts behind him were like this, he would have kicked them out of the Milky Way galaxy. This little Cheline was Ning Xuemore's, and their relationship wasn't just a little good. If he sent the little Cheline flying with a kick, he reckoned that once Ning Xuemore recovered, she wouldn't let him off. He resisted the urge to kick it and shouted in a low voice, "Don't cry." Chapter 693. Kirene's tears immediately flowed like a river again. "Master, you can't die. If you die, Little Apple won't be able to live. Little Apple hasn't lived long enough. I haven't become strong. I haven't returned home in glory. Little Apple doesn't want to die." The ancestor felt a headache coming on. "Shut up." He couldn't bear it anymore and shouted. Kirene still had resentment in her heart. Now that she was shouted at by the ancestor, she forgot to be afraid of him. "It's all your fault. You could have arrived earlier. You could have prevented her from suffering. If you hadn't gone to that tea house to drink that nuisance tea, she would have been alive and kicking right now. She wouldn't have ended up like this." This little bastard was really rebellious. She actually dared to talk to him like this. The ancestor was already anxious. Now that he was blocked by Kirene's words, anger surged in his heart. His voice suddenly became cold. "I don't have any obligation to save her. It's already good enough that I helped her." As soon as he finished speaking, he seemed to have noticed something. He turned his head and looked inside the green barrier held by his fingertips. Ning Xuemore's soul had stopped crying at some point. At this moment, she was curled up in a corner of the barrier, her body trembling slightly. Her soul was originally pieced together in a mess by Yi Qingwan. Now, even her face couldn't be seen. Therefore, the ancestor couldn't see her expression clearly. "Ning Xuemore." He called her tentatively. Ning Xuemore curled up in the barrier and didn't respond. It seemed that her consciousness hadn't recovered yet. "Ning Xuemore, can you sense me?" The ancestor's finger gently stroked the green ball. Ning Xuemore still didn't have much reaction. She curled up even more. After a while, she said, "It hurts." Thank God, although she was still in pain, she finally stopped crying. The ancestor couldn't do anything about her current pain. He could only wait until he got back. He was about to fly up, but Ning Xuemore spat out two words that stopped him in his tracks. "Yi Feng." How could she think of another man at this moment of dizziness? Di Zun's face didn't look good. Kirene, who was at his feet, jumped up. "Oh yeah, Yi Feng." At that time, Master said that Yi Feng had helped her escape. She even said that she wanted you to help Yi Feng recover his cultivation. The ancestor lowered his eyes slightly. He didn't like to meddle in other people's business. But since Ning Xuemore wanted to meddle in this matter, for her sake, he should save the Sharkmen. Otherwise, she would be even more dissatisfied with him when she woke up. With Bright Reverence Cult's current situation, it was very easy for the ancestor to save Yi Feng. He just casually asked a Bright Reverence Cult disciple, and that disciple immediately took him to the reincarnation pool. He fished out Yi Feng, who was on the verge of death. Because Yi Qingwan was in a hurry to deal with Ning Xuemore, she didn't have time to torment him. Yi Feng didn't have many wounds on his body, he was just exhausted. The ancestor glanced at Yi Feng and knew that his wounds couldn't be immediately healed. Helpless, he could only take Yi Feng with him. On the way back, he contacted Rongi Weshenlan and ordered him to send Ning Xuemore's body to Buddha Lotus Mountain's Sun Moon sect. On Carefree Island, Rongi Weshenlan didn't dare to leave the main hall where he was treating Ning Xuemore. Ning Xuemore's soul had already been lost to him. If anything happened to her body, the ancestor would probably tear him apart. Yunshi also sat beside him to accompany him. Chapter 694. Rome Yueshenlan originally wanted Yunshi to leave first, but she refused. She felt that she was responsible for the loss of Ning Xuemo's soul. If she hadn't suffered from qi deviation and needed treatment, Rome Yueshenlan wouldn't have left. She wasn't prepared to leave before she received definite news about Ning Xuemo. Rome Yueshenlan glanced at her and didn't say anything else. He tacitly allowed her to stay. During this time, Rome Yueshenlan didn't leave the main hall. Yunshi was afraid that he would be bored and suggested a few games of chess, but he rejected her. Guarding the mud shell that contained Ning Xuemo's body was even more important than Grand Supreme Elderly Lord refining pills. At this time, Rome Yueshenlan received news from the Di Zun and immediately started to make preparations. At this time, Ning Xuemo's body had almost fully recovered. He carefully broke the mud shell and revealed the person inside. This time, there weren't any problems with the recovery. Rome Yueshenlan used his telekinesis to check her aura. It was as good as expected. That pair of small feet should have recovered as well. He heaved a sigh of relief. Finally, there weren't any accidents with this body. He told the Di Zun this good news, but the Di Zun only replied, "Use your telekinesis to protect her. Send her over." Rome Yueshenlan was still worried about Ning Xuemo's soul. Di Zue, how is her soul? The voice on the other side deepened slightly, but he replied casually, "It's all right. Bring the purple cloud fruit over." The purple cloud fruit was specially used to recuperate the soul. It could greatly enhance the soul's ability to condense. When Rome Yueshenlan heard this, his heart sank. That little girl's soul was about to disperse. It couldn't be, right? That little girl's soul was so valiant. She could even play chess with him in a soul state. What had happened to her? He was curious. At the same time, he was also concerned about Ning Xuemo, his chess friend. He couldn't care less about losing another precious fruit. He immediately started to make arrangements. Yunshi volunteered, "Romue, I'm also worried about Miss Ning. I'll go with you." Romue Tianlan's busy fingers paused slightly as she glanced at Yunshi. After muttering to herself for a moment, she said, "Yunshi, Di Zue and I truly treat you as a friend. You have always been sensible, generous, and courteous. I don't wish to see any other changes in you. Some feelings that are not yours are not yours. If you force it, you might not even be able to be friends." These words were very direct. Yunshi was stunned. Her little scheme had been exposed, and she blushed. Subconsciously, she retorted, "I won't." "Yes, Yunshi, I knew you wouldn't. Remember, you will only be happy if you maintain your original heart." Rong Yueshenlan patted her shoulder with her fan and turned to leave. He had already said everything that needed to be said. Now, it all depended on Yunshi's ability to comprehend. If Di Zue had never been tempted by anyone, he would have encouraged Yunshi to fight for him. However, Di Zue already had someone in his heart. Yunshi would only embarrass herself if she interfered. He didn't want the trio to fall apart. The pain was earth-shattering. The pain engulfed her once again. She couldn't help but scream and cry. When she opened her eyes wide, she could only see scarlet. She couldn't see anything else. She dashed left and right in this overwhelming scarlet, wanting to rush out. Rush out, rush out, rush out. Perhaps she wouldn't be in so much pain if she rushed out. Shuemo, be good. I'm here. Don't be afraid. A voice seemed to pierce through the clouds. It seemed that the person this girl subconsciously trusted the most was not him. Romeu coughed and said, "Di Zue, maybe we should find someone she trusts the most and try calling her." He looked at the hourglass in the corner of the hall and frowned. "We can't delay any longer." There was a time limit to doing something like this. Once the time limit was exceeded, the effect would be greatly reduced. Even if he managed to repair her soul and place it back into her original body, he was afraid that something else would happen. For example, she would lose her memory, or she would go crazy, or she would be forgetful, or she would even forget who she was. Chapter 696. The ancestor suddenly sent out a message, "Call that Kirin in." This time, the little Chelene was very sensitive. When Ning Xuemore was brought to the quiet room for treatment, it was also left outside because it was afraid of loud noises. The only requirement here was absolute silence, which the disciples of the Sun-Moon sect understood the best. Within a dozen miles, there would be no sound at all, so as not to disturb the treatment inside. Although Kirin was worried about its master, it still obediently lay at the door, not daring to breathe, not even daring to move its claws, like a stone Kirin statue. When the ancestor went in, he clearly told it not to use telepathy to contact Ning Xuemore during this period. It was also obedient. Although it was very worried, it did not dare to use telepathy to detect Ning Xuemore's recovery. Not only did it maintain absolute silence, but it also guarded against others. Not far away, the Sun-Moon sect disciple guarding the door just raised his hand silently, making a sound softer than a leaf falling to the ground, but Kirin stared at him for a long time like an enemy. The person stared at him for a long time, not daring to make the slightest movement like a stone man. Kirin naturally heard the ancestor's command, and its heart jumped. It did not understand what happened, and thought that its master had an accident, so it hurriedly walked in like a cat. It held its breath and looked at the green barrier, then looked at Rongyue Tianlan and the ancestor, its eyes full of questions. Try to wake her up with telepathy. The ancestor's words were always concise. Wasn't he afraid that it would disturb its master, so he did not let it use telepathy? Kirin was full of questions, but it could not ignore the ancestor's command. It tried to call a few times, "Master. Master. Master, I am Little Apple. Master." The restless soul in the barrier suddenly stopped, no longer blindly rushing left and right, as if it was listening to something. There was a door. Rongyue Tianlan's eyes lit up, and he signaled Kirin to continue. Kirin's spirits were lifted as well. He called out to her a few more times. "Master, wake up. You're out of danger. You're safe now. Wake up. We're all here." The rampaging soul trembled a few times before a hoarse voice could be heard. Little Apple?" Her consciousness had been pulled back. Everyone was overjoyed. Rongyue Tianlan was secretly happy and blurted out, "It turns out that she trusts this Kirin the most at the critical moment." As soon as he finished speaking, he seemed to feel that it was inappropriate and shot a glance at the ancestor. The ancestor was expressionless. His eyes were fixed on Ning Xuemore's soul, as if he didn't hear Rongyue Tianlan's words. Kirin was overjoyed and immediately said, "It's me, Master. It's me. You can see me, right?" There was a wisp of smoke moving around the soul, as if Ning Xuemore was trying her best to push aside the fog and look outside. Her soul was so distorted that it did not look like a human. Kirin could not see her face even with its eyes wide open. However, it could feel that Ning Xuemore seemed to see it, and she even stretched out her hand to it. Now is the time. The ancestor and Rongyue Tianlan worked at the same time, and the green barrier was removed. At the same time, a wave of red light popped out from the cauldron and directly covered Ning Xuemore's soul, pulling it into the cauldron. Chapter 697. Ning Xuemore's soul was only a little bit awakened. She was not fully awake yet. All her reactions were still instinctive. She felt that she had finally followed Kirin's voice and pushed away the blood fog, allowing her to take a breath. But she did not expect that before she could take a breath, a large sea of blood would hit her in the face. She seemed to have thought of something. Her whole body trembled, and she struggled vigorously in the red light. She seemed to be afraid of this big cauldron. Kirin's heart was raised high. Di Zun naturally also noticed this problem. He was a little startled, and immediately thought of something. His face changed slightly, and he quickly whispered to Kirin, "Tell her, this is not the soul-refining cauldron. This is the Ansheng pool. It is used to heal her. As long as she obediently cooperates, it will not hurt anymore." Kirin immediately passed his words to Ning Xuemore. Ning Xuemore's body trembled. Finally, she stopped struggling, but she was still trembling. After trembling for a moment, She still asked, Really? Really? More real than real gold? Master, this little Chelene only wants the best for you. It absolutely won't lie to you. The little Chelene repeatedly comforted her and guided her movements according to the ancestors' instructions. Master, relax, relax, close your eyes and use your inner vision to sense yourself. In the red light, Ning Shuamore listened to Karine's words. Although her body was still trembling from the pain, she still followed Karine's instructions step by step. It seemed that she trusted Karine very much. And Di Zun, who was Han Shanyu, obviously did not trust her husband enough. Rongyue Tianlan almost could not bear to look at Di Zun's cold face. Rongyue, if you are not afraid of being slapped out of Buddha Lotus Mountain by me, then go ahead and be absent-minded. Di Zun's cold voice passed into Rongyue Tianlan's ears. Rongyue Tianlan coughed and did not dare to be absent-minded again. He worked together with Di Zun to operate the big cauldron. The liquid in the cauldron began to circulate slowly. It slowly climbed up and reached the red barrier. Like blood veins, they crisscrossed on the red barrier and slowly extended to Ning Shuamore's messy soul. They were like warm water that moistened and corrected the messy soul. This period of time was long and thrilling. Karine didn't even dare to breathe loudly. It only dared to speak when the ancestor asked it to, lest it take a wrong step and push its master into eternal damnation. Ning Shuamore felt the pain in her soul gradually lessen as the blood vessels in the red light circulated. She could feel that her organs were slowly returning to their original positions, and she was no longer in so much pain. This calmed her down a lot, and she followed Karine's instructions step by step. During this period of time, the ancestor felt that it was too troublesome to pass messages back and forth, so he simply gave the orders himself. However, Ning Shuamore didn't listen to him at all. The moment he opened his mouth, she shrank back instead. Helplessly, he could only let Karine continue to command. Di Zun's complexion was not good. Rongyue Tianlan tried his best not to look at Di Zun's face. Otherwise, if he laughed out unkindly, the ancestor would fly into a rage out of humiliation and slap him out. The two peerless experts joined hands to calm down Ning Shuamore's soul and heal her. The efficiency was naturally very high. In addition, Ning Shuamore was very smart and her willpower was also very strong. She was in so much pain and was not very clear-headed, but she could still follow Karine's commands and actions. She did not do a bad job at all. Even Rongyue Tianlan, who was experienced and knowledgeable, was amazed. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.